Chapter 1030. On the way back, Li Nanheng didn't say anything. He let her sit in the back and rest with her eyes closed. After sending her home, he watched her enter the house and slam the door, but he didn't intend to come in. After closing the door, Feng Ling locked the door from the inside and buckled the hidden lock inside the door. After making sure that even if he had the key, he couldn't open the last hidden lock outside, she turned back to the bedroom. She took the time to take the thermometer to take her temperature. Although she had taken medicine during the day, it was still more than 38 degrees. No wonder she had been feeling uncomfortable. She wanted to take a shower. After drying her hair, she inadvertently glanced outside. The light next door had never been turned on. Feng Ling withdrew her gaze and turned to boil water for herself. It had nothing to do with her whether the light was on or not. The next morning, after getting up, she really didn't have the strength to go for a morning run today, nor did she want to make food. She sat on the sofa and closed her eyes for another hour. When it was almost time for work, she got up and was about to go out, when she suddenly heard the sound of a message coming in. She picked up the phone and saw a message from Li Nanheng. Eat less bread, salad and jam during your illness. I bought you Chinese breakfast porridge. She pushed the door open and went out. Sure enough, on the small shelf outside the door there was breakfast. Several round boxes were neatly placed in a plastic bag. She suddenly remembered that when she was at 11 base, Xiao Su once said, Boss Li was a typical arrogant person. Nothing could easily enter his eyes. There were really few people who could be treated and cherished by him so patiently and carefully. Even if they could get a little care and protection from him, they definitely stood at the top of his heart. Feng Ling glanced at those things but didn't take them. She closed the door, picked up her coat, put on her shoes and pushed the door out. She didn't even take a look at the breakfast. She passed by, pressed the elevator and went to work. She arrived at the martial arts club 40 minutes earlier than usual. Seeing that she was early, the head coach asked her if she had had breakfast. When he learned that she hadn't eaten yet, he went to buy her some hot milk and some breakfast biscuits to fill her stomach. At 10 o'clock, Feng Ling was sitting behind her desk eating breakfast biscuits. At this time the office door was pushed open and her new assistant, Li Nanheng, came to report on time. He glanced at the food she was eating and asked without batting an eyelid, "What time does class start?" Feng Ling glanced at him. She didn't expect him to actually plan to work here. She glanced at the time, picked up another biscuit and said coldly, "Right away." However, when he was about to change his clothes, he glanced at the breakfast biscuits on her table out of the corner of his eye. At the same time he saw a bag of the same biscuits on the head coach's desk next door. His eyes turned cold and he turned to leave. In the past 10 days, Li Nanheng was taken in by the boss of the martial arts club. The one who suffered the most was Qin Beiqing, who was tortured every time he came to class. In particular, Qin Beiqing habitually asked someone to send flowers to Feng Ling before class. Previously, the flowers were picked up by the cleaning auntie and placed in the vase as decorations. Now he couldn't even enter the martial arts club. Except for Feng Ling and the head coach, all the staff in the martial arts club said in unison that the weather had been cold recently, their noses were uncomfortable, and they couldn't stand the smell of flowers or pollen, especially roses. In the past 10 days, Feng Ling saw the warm breakfast outside the door every morning and walked by expressionlessly as usual. She didn't eat a bite, but she still saw the breakfast outside the door on time every morning. Every night, in order not to be forced into the car again, she drove to and from work by herself. Li Nanheng had been following her, not too close nor too far, but he didn't say anything. When she went home, the man was also not too far away from her, as if they were really colleagues on the way home, but when she walked out of the elevator, he didn't say anything. She went home but he watched her outside, didn't come in and didn't speak. Every time she closed the door at night, the more miserable Qin Beiqing was the next day. Twice he lay on the ground and couldn't get up. He felt that he was about to be crippled by the new coach Li, but when he went to the hospital for a checkup, he found that he was not injured at all. However, the movements that Coach Li asked him to do were all movements that could make people exhausted. They did not seem to have many ups and downs, but in fact they were very tiring. The kind of tiredness that could kill him after a long time. After 10 peaceful days, when Qin Beiqing heard a crisp sound from his arm again, he suddenly turned pale from the pain and tried to pull his hand back, but Nanheng looked at him coldly. "The muscles and bones in your arm are so fragile. You can't even twist and balance. I'm afraid that even if you study here for another 10 years, you will still be a waste." Qin Beiqing was in so much pain that his forehead was sweating. He endured the pain, looked up at Coach Li who had been twisting his arm to the limit and smiled at him. "Do you really think I can't see why you are targeting me? We are all men. If we want to compete, we should be fair. Don't use your identity to target me. Are you sure Coach Ling can't see through your tricks? Li Nanheng looked at him indifferently and didn't hide anything. He smiled and said in a voice that only he could hear, I'm afraid you won't have a chance to see my real means in this life. When you see it, you'll be dead. Qin Beiqing smiled, but the sweat on his forehead was still dripping. I just like two women at the same time. I accept fair competition. Li Nanheng smiled coldly. The moment Qin Beiqing said fair competition, he kicked Qin Beiqing's knee over. Qin Beiqing grunted and suddenly fell to the ground. His eyes were cold and his voice was as cold as a glacier. If you want to compete with me fairly, I'm afraid you'll have to cultivate for a few more years. Qin Beiqing was indeed in pain, but it was a lie to say that it wasn't painful. He gritted his teeth, stood up, looked up at Li Nanheng and sneered. If you like a woman, confess your love to her. Don't play these useless tricks here. Even I despise you, let alone her. I don't think she is nice to you at all. I'm afraid you have been rejected countless times. However, with another kick, Qin Beiqing staggered and fell to the ground again. Chapter 1031. Qin Beiqing endured the sharp pain all over his body. The moment he raised his head, he heard the man's condescending and cold voice. When I was honest with my woman, you were still sitting on a piece of diapers and playing with mud. Qin Beiqing frowned and was about to stand up, when his shoulder was pressed by the man. The pressure exerted on him forced him to kneel on one knee and couldn't get up. But Qin Beiqing could feel that Li Nanheng must have known Coach Ling longer than him. But even so, Qin Beiqing had no intention of admitting defeat or giving way. Even though he was pressed to the ground by his shoulder and sweat was dripping down his forehead, he still sneered. You were chasing her when I was still wearing a diaper. It seems that you haven't won her heart for a long time. You're really a senior. You must have more experience of failure than a newbie like me. Senior Li, please remind me what she hates most about you. The pressure on his shoulder increased again, making Qin Beiqing suspect that his shoulder would be crushed by the man in the next moment. You're courting death. Li Nanheng. At this time the door of the classroom was opened and Feng Ling walked in. Seeing this scene she was not surprised at all. She looked at Qin Beiqing who was still unwilling to admit defeat even though he was pressed to the ground, and then turned her eyes to the other man. What are you doing? Li Nanheng expressionlessly moved his hand away from Qin Beiqing's body, clapped his hands casually, and glanced at her with a faint smile. Nothing. He was trying to cover it up, but his attitude was so perfunctory. It was clear that he didn't like Qin Beiqing. Feng Ling didn't bother to meddle in their business these days. These two people were crazy. They fought with each other in the open and in the dark every day. She really didn't want to interfere. Anyway, both of them were big trouble. If one of them died, there would be one less. Perhaps only when both of them were crippled would her world be peaceful. The coach wants to talk to you. Come out for a while. Feng Ling said and turned to leave. Seeing that Feng Ling didn't even bother to look at them, Li Nanheng shook off the man on the ground. Qin Beiqing half knelt on the ground and also looked at the man who had turned to leave. Then the two of them looked at each other indifferently and then looked away coldly and silently. When Li Nanheng also went out, Qin Beiqing got up from the ground, picked up a bottle of mineral water and poured it on his head. After sobering up, he raised a towel and wiped his face with it. Then he looked outside with one hand on his waist, gasped violently in the classroom, and slowly calmed his breath while pacing back and forth. He needed to think of a countermeasure, but after thinking for a long time, he found that he really didn't even know who Li Nanheng was. It seemed that it was not easy to compete fairly. In the office, when the coach saw Feng Ling, he came over with a smile and was about to talk to her, when he suddenly caught a glimpse of Li Nanheng who came in. The smile on his face instantly disappeared, and he looked up at the man in front of the door. The boss is not here these 2 days. Leave the things here to me for the time being. Recently, there have been a lot of people applying to be coaches in the martial arts club. Mr. Li, you don't have a good reason to come here. I don't know how good your martial arts skills are. It doesn't seem right for you to stand here and occupy other people's positions just because you know some fancy martial arts. Why don't we find a time to have a match? Li Nanheng's eyes were indifferent and he even seemed to want to laugh. You want to have a match with me? Since you say it so bluntly, I don't have to be too tactful. The coach snorted. Let's find a chance to have a match, okay? Li Nanheng put one hand in his trouser pocket and said indifferently, you decide the time. Seeing his fearless look, the coach looked at his height and the well-proportioned muscles on his arms. He couldn't see it through his clothes, but he could feel that Li Nanheng's martial arts skills were not bad. In recent days, the male students in Feng Ling's class had also complained that the new assistant coach was very good at martial arts, but he was stricter than Coach Ling. When he was really harsh, a group of people would complain incessantly. Coach Lee personally supervised the movements and wouldn't stop until everyone was in a state of pain that was worse than death. At this time, the coach suddenly smiled and walked up to him. "Your clothes fit you very well. I just don't know when you really practice." As he said this, he reached out to hold Li Nanheng's wrist through his sleeves. However, before he could exert any strength, Li Nanheng suddenly avoided the force between his fingers. At the same time, he suddenly grabbed his wrist. Even though it seemed that Li Nanheng only grabbed his wrist back, in fact, a sharp pain came from his wrist. At the same time, the head coach looked at him again and saw the obvious warning in Li Nanheng's eyes. The head coach did not speak. He only looked at Li Nanheng's hand that was able to dodge his hand so quickly and without leaving a trace and even easily catch him. Although it was just a small handshake, it was obvious that this Li Nanheng was not simple. His martial arts skills and reaction speed were much better than he had imagined. Although he was a head coach here, in terms of martial arts skills, he was probably much weaker than him. Just like this, the two of them held hands with very calm smiles on their faces, but they had already secretly competed with each other. When the head coach pulled his hand out of his palm and quietly put his pale, bloodless hand behind his back, Li Nanheng looked at him calmly. "Head coach, do you have something to say?" The head coach didn't speak for a while and just looked at Li Nanheng. The two men looked at each other in silence. Although it was not as fierce as when Qin Beiqing was around, this silent confrontation made Feng Ling feel an inexplicable chill on her back. The two of them wouldn't really fight because of her, would they? Because of her? It shouldn't be. Just when Feng Ling felt that she was thinking too much and that it was impossible for them to fight, the pain in the head coach's hand had recovered a lot. He casually put his hand by his side and didn't touch Li Nanheng again. He just said, "Tonight, the stadium of the opposite Polytechnic University is open to the public every week. Why don't we go there to have a friendly match? It won't involve any interests. How about it?" "Feng Ling." Li Nanheng smiled coldly. "Up to you. I'll accompany you." Feng Ling. Chapter 1032. In the evening. While Li Nanheng was still supervising the movements of the students, Feng Ling walked out of the classroom and went straight to the head coach. "Head coach, don't go to the stadium at night," Feng Ling said. The head coach's class today had already ended. He had changed his clothes and was waiting for them to go to the stadium together. Hearing her words, he looked up at her. "What? Are you afraid that I can't beat him?" "No, I just don't think there's a need to fight. It's meaningless. Do you understand what I mean?" The head coach stood by the table and watched her for a while before saying, "You mean that no matter whether I can beat him or not, you won't have any feelings for me, just like how you treated Qin Beiqing? Just because we are colleagues, you have been very polite to me. But if I accidentally expose my feelings for you and fight with Li Nanheng, will you be very upset that you are involved in such a matter?" Feng Ling. "Since you know that, why do you still fight?" The head coach smiled. "Ling, you don't understand a man's mentality. If I lose, I lose. If I win, I win. No matter what, it's fine. But since I like the same person, I should solve it in a man's way. Even if I know I can't beat him, at least I tried." Feng Ling really couldn't understand. Also, the head coach raised his eyebrows. "Many of your martial arts skills seem to be similar to his. Although Li Nanheng has only been helping you teach those students recently and hasn't fought much, I can tell from some clues in his movements and fighting habits. Did he teach you all your skills?" Only someone who had a good foundation in martial arts and could carefully study and see through other people's martial arts skills could see all this from such small clues. Although the head coach might not be able to beat Li Nanheng, after all, he had been in this industry for so many years. He could remember any random movement of others. So although he didn't say anything about Li Nanheng being taken in these days, it was clear that nothing could be hidden from his eyes. "I have a friend who works in the Los Angeles Police Department. He told me about 11 Base. That day, I felt that I had seen Li Nanheng's name somewhere before, so I searched it with the search terms in Los Angeles. Although I couldn't find much information about the Li family on the internet, and most of the information about 11 Base was confidential, I still saw Li Nanheng's name in the legal database of 11 Base." The head coach stared at Feng Ling's calm face as he spoke. "If he is the person in charge of 11 Base, then who are you? Previously, I always saw that your skills were not bad and you were so young, so I was very curious about what kind of experience you had. Now I can't help but wonder, are you a member of 11 Base?" "Yes." In the face of such conclusive evidence, Feng Ling really had nothing to hide. After all, even if she lied and said no, he knew she was lying. Therefore it was better to be calm. 11 Base actually accepts women? If 11 Base was willing to accept women, I wouldn't have come to Boston right now. Feng Ling didn't explain too much. After saying this, she thought for a moment and said, "Those are all in the past. I don't want to mention it again, but since you've guessed his identity, don't fight." The head coach only smiled, glanced at the classroom not far away, and then looked at the time on his wrist. "I'll wait for him." Feng Ling frowned. "You still want to fight? Why not?" The head coach raised his brows. "Feng Ling, at night. In the gymnasium of the Polytechnic University." In Feng Ling's eyes, the fight between the two men was too childish and strange. She really couldn't figure it out. Both of them were grown men in their 20s. Li Nanheng usually disdained to fight with others, and the head coach was usually the steady type, but they actually hit it off and ran over to fight as soon as they said they were going to fight. She couldn't be bothered to go to the stadium and directly drove home. After entering the house, she directly locked the door, too lazy to pay attention to the two lunatics. In the stadium, the two men didn't fight for long. The head coach knew he couldn't win and kept defending. Li Nanheng could also see that the other party was also testing him, so his attacks were very perfunctory. In the end, after spending more than an hour, there was no result. The two tall and long-legged men finally couldn't be bothered to fight anymore. They both lay on the ground of the stadium, panting. They didn't continue fighting, nor did they speak. They just lay there watching the lights above the stadium. "It's really my honor to be able to compete with the boss of 11 Base here." The head coach looked at the lights above and said while panting, "I thought you wanted to directly come here to cripple me. I didn't expect you to be letting me win." Li Nanheng also only panted a few times. He lay there and snorted disapprovingly. "You really know quite a lot. I also just learned that you are the boss of 11 Base." At first I was indeed shocked, but thinking about Ah Ling's skills, I was already amazed. Your appearance and your identity as the boss of 11 Base only made me finally understand where she learned her skills from. As expected of the famous 11 Base. Even a little girl can learn such good skills. If I wanted to go because of the fame, I wonder if they would still accept me at my age? The head coach said while smiling. Li Nanheng didn't answer but just looked at the lights above indifferently. There was a moment of silence. Finally, the head coach stood up, sat on the spot, and looked at the empty stadium, saying, "Although I don't know why Ah Ling left your 11 Base, in my impression when she first came to our martial arts club a year and a half ago, she was so quiet that many of us wondered if she had a personality defect. Later we found that although the way she taught the students in class was strict and indifferent, she was very meticulous and taught well. Over time, we confirmed that she just didn't like to communicate with others and never liked to talk nonsense. Moreover, she was very defensive and wouldn't get too close to anyone. At that time, except during class time, she was always alone. When we went to talk to her, she just looked at us silently and didn't have the slightest intention to integrate with others. She was like a loner. I began to notice her from then on. I really have never seen a girl with such a personality." The head coach smiled and said, "Inexplicably, I feel that under her silence, there must be injuries and thorns all over her body. Otherwise, she wouldn't have such a thick armor and wouldn't refuse everyone's approach. I have always been wondering what kind of experience she had." Chapter 1033. Li Nanheng did not speak. The head coach continued, "After that I asked her several times about her past, but she refused to say anything. She only said that it was not a good memory. In fact, I was more curious about where she learned to be so skilled. She was so young but she didn't say anything. Even her name was Ah Ling. This Ah Ling is a mystery to all of us. But because she is really good at martial arts, the boss cherishes talent very much. Even though she is mysterious, he still kept her until now. Every time there's a festival, whether it's a Western festival or the Chinese New Year, which is very important to the Chinese, I find that she's always alone. She never celebrates a festival and she never mentions her birthday. She goes to work and gets off work on time every day, and she still doesn't communicate with others. Now that we've known each other for a while, she occasionally talks to me, but it's all about work. She still doesn't talk about anything outside of work. If it weren't for you, Mr. Li, I would never have thought that this young girl used to be a member of 11 Base. Now that I know where she came from, I'm even more curious. Why did she leave 11 Base and why did she treat you? Who was her former boss so coldly? All of her defenses and the hidden injuries all over her body, just who was it that caused her to do all of this? You. Li Nanheng also sat up at this time. He silently looked at the front of the stadium and said indifferently, "Is the fight over? Can I go now?" The head coach turned to look at him and suddenly chuckled, "She is a mystery that we can't solve. Perhaps only you can understand. I wish you good luck." Li Nanheng did not speak and directly walked out. He sped all the way back to Feng Ling's residence. When he arrived outside, he looked at the tightly shut door. Without thinking, that woman had locked it from the inside again. Li Nanheng was about to turn to open the door next door when his footsteps suddenly paused. There seemed to be some residual smell in the air. The smell was very faint, but it was very obvious. Out of the corner of his eye, the man saw a footprint on the ground left by the sole of a shoe, and then glanced at the open door of the safety passage escalator not far away. 10 minutes ago. Feng Ling was taking a shower in her room. After the shower, she heard someone knocking on the door. She was too lazy to pay attention to it. Hearing the person outside knocking persistently, she glanced at the light next door and thought that Li Nanheng had returned from the fight with the head coach. She didn't know whether he had won or lost. She guessed that if he won, he probably came to show off to her. If he lost, he probably came to vent his anger on her. Anyway, it was nothing good, so she was too lazy to open the door. However, she was annoyed by the knocking. She suspected that Li Nanheng was drunk. Otherwise, why would he knock so hard? She got up impatiently and walked out. She pulled the door open and said, "Li Nanheng, I'm warning you. In the future, don't." Before she finished speaking, she instinctively raised her guard when she saw the 3 strange men standing outside the door. At this time, no one else knew that she lived here. She thought it was Li Nanheng, so she walked out angrily and was unprepared. When she subconsciously wanted to close the door, the 3 people outside the door had quickly stepped forward and held her shoulders. When she struggled to fight back, another person directly pressed her against the door, picked up a slightly wet square cloth, and pressed it against her nose. The moment Feng Ling smelled the smell, she instinctively held her breath. However, because she took a breath, she was dazed for a moment. At this moment, the 3 men pressed her hands and feet and then pressed the cloth between her nose and mouth. No matter how long Feng Ling had been trained to hold her breath, she still couldn't help but take another breath after more than 3 minutes. This second breath caused her to completely lose the strength to struggle. Earlier, she barely had the strength to raise her foot to kick them. At this moment, she fell down powerlessly. Seeing that she had lost the ability to resist, the 2 men behind her raised their hands and slammed the back of her neck. When the woman in front of them suddenly fell down softly, they looked at each other, carried her up, and slammed the door shut. In case they bumped into someone in the elevator, they opened the door of the escalator and quickly took her away. The night was beautiful. On a deserted road somewhere in Boston, a black car sped wildly. In the car, 3 men looked at the short-haired woman whose hands and feet were tied and lying motionless on the back seat. Is this the girlfriend that the Chin family's brat has been pining for? I'm not sure if she's his girlfriend, but he definitely likes her. I've observed for a long time. That brat orders flowers and sends them to her every day. Every day he goes to that martial arts club just to catch a glimpse of her. In short, if we want the Chin family's brat and his father to hand over the thing, it's useless to find them. We might as well take this woman away. Based on that brat's feelings for her, he definitely won't sit back and do nothing. Was it this woman who stopped our men a year ago? Yes, it's her. This chick's skills are not bad. Otherwise, why would the 3 of us be sent to deal with her? On the road at night, the car sped forward. At the same time, a black Hummer suddenly appeared in the restless night. It chased closely behind the car, getting faster and faster. By the time the people in the car noticed that there seemed to be a car chasing behind them, the black Hummer had already rushed over at a crazy speed. The speed of their car was already very fast, but in the end it couldn't outrun a model like the Hummer. They stepped hard on the accelerator but were still overtaken by the Hummer in an instant. The moment after the Hummer overtook the car, the black Hummer suddenly stopped in the middle of the road with a decisive momentum. Just as the 2 cars were about to collide, the 3 people in the car screamed in horror and hurriedly stepped on the brakes. However, because the speed was too fast and the distance was too close, they couldn't stop the car too quickly. The whole car directly crashed into the black Hummer. The Hummer's body was very big. In front of this small car, it couldn't be easily shaken. With a bang, there was a violent impact. At the moment when the front of the car was dented, the Hummer's door only caved in a little. In an instant, the surrounding air was filled with the smell of gasoline leaking from the fuel tank and a faint smell of gunpowder. The 2 cars collided violently. When the 3 people saw that they couldn't stop, they hurriedly shrank back. They were almost unable to breathe because of the airbag. Chapter 1034. Feng Ling, who had been unconscious in the back seat, abruptly fell to the ground due to the impact. Her head hit the car door hard. She suddenly frowned and opened her eyes with some difficulty. Her vision darkened. But the smell around her and the situation around her allowed her to quickly figure out the situation in front of her in a severe coma and dizziness. Feng Ling tried to struggle but found that she had no strength. Her hands and feet were also tied tightly. In the darkness of the car, she turned around and saw the airbag popping out and the three people who struggled out of the airbag and cursed under their breath. Her impression of the three people returned to the moment when the door opened, and she immediately frowned. Fuck, where did this bastard come from? Did he rush out to block the road without a care for his life? One of the people who had just struggled out of the airbag cursed and reached out to grab a long steel rod under the back seat. He directly pushed open the deformed car door and rushed out. Feng Ling didn't move and they didn't find that she had woken up. They each picked up whatever they could hit, endured the sharp pain from the impact and all got out of the car. Feng Ling didn't know what had happened outside. She was suddenly woken up and her entire body was in pain. However, if it weren't for the intense pain from the impact, she most likely wouldn't have woken up under the strong effects of the drug. Although she was awake, her body didn't have any strength at all. She secretly observed the surroundings and slowly moved her bound hands and feet, trying to break free. However, she found that the rope was very tight and there was no space for her to move. The three people who got out of the car looked at the car that suddenly rushed over to block the road in front of them. The black Hummer was unaffected except for a slight dent in the door. Even the windows were still tightly closed and there was no damage. In the dark night, the black Hummer was like the god of death from hell. It was motionless, but it seemed to be permeating with a coldness that sent chills down one's spine. Let's go see where this bastard came from. This car seems to be a modified Hummer. Even if this model is very sturdy, it's too sturdy. Is it a military car? Even if it's a military car, it has to call us Dad here. Let's go see. Go. The three of them were holding steel rods and various weapons that they had hidden in the car. They even had 2 guns on their waist. Seeing that the car was not moving, they approached it hesitantly. Just as the person walking in front suddenly gathered his courage and was about to pull the door open, the driver's seat door suddenly opened and even slammed outwards with great force, causing the person who had just walked to the door to feel a pain in his chest. He took a few steps back awkwardly and was supported by 2 people who rushed over from behind. The 3 of them raised their heads at the same time and saw a tall and straight man get out of the car. His gaze seemed to have no trace of warmth at all as he slammed the door with a bang. Then he stood on the spot and glanced at the person in front of them with clear eyes. Who are you? Why are you blocking our way? This man didn't seem to be a simple character, but they had only done some shady business with the Chen family in Boston. They didn't remember provoking the man in front of them. Moreover, the Hummer didn't look like someone from an ordinary place could drive it. They instinctively felt that they had to be careful. Li Nanheng coldly looked at the deformed car in front of him, and his ink-black eyes were icy cold. Put my people down. The 3 people were startled, exchanged a few glances and turned to him at the same time suspiciously. Your people? I have no interest in entangling with a group of small characters like you. Let my people go. I won't interfere with your disputes with other families. Li Nanheng expressionlessly walked in the direction of the car. Because of his movement, the 3 people tightened their grip on the steel rods in their hands and subconsciously took precautions. However, the man didn't even look at them. The car was leaking gasoline drop by drop and was likely to spontaneously combust. Feng Ling was still inside. Li Nanheng quickened his steps as if there was wind behind him. At the moment when one of them thought he was going to do something and suddenly raised his rod to rush toward him, Li Nanheng raised his arm and slapped him away without looking back. Then he raised his foot and kicked the other person away. At the same time he quickly walked to the car door, pulled it open, opened the door and entered. Sure enough, Feng Ling was lying inside. The moment the car door opened, Feng Ling, who had been struggling to untie the rope, turned her eyes and met the man's eyes. Almost instantly Feng Ling suddenly mouthed, "Be careful." Li Nanheng's gaze was still fixed on her. He didn't look back, but the moment the person behind swung the rod down, he accurately raised his hand to grab the other person's wrist, snatched the rod and turned back to kick the person. At the same time the steel rod that was thrown up rolled into his hand. Li Nanheng directly pressed the person who had fallen to the ground with the steel rod and expressionlessly withdrew his gaze. He directly kicked the deformed car door down and strode into the car. As he bent down to help Feng Ling up, he directly untied the rope around her wrist. Feng Ling's entire body was weak. The moment the man helped her up, she felt the warmth of his hand. She didn't speak but just looked at him. Her eyes were slightly red from the drug, but at least she could see the man's face clearly. How did you know that something happened to me? Her voice was very low and she couldn't muster much strength. Let's get out of here first. The man's voice was heavy. The moment he untied the rope around her wrist, he saw that the rope around her feet was even tighter. With an ugly expression, he was about to carry her out of the car. All of a sudden, another steel rod was swung down from the other side. Feng Ling was about to shout for him to be careful, but before she could, the man had already dodged with her in his arms. However, in order not to fall, he could only turn his back. The steel rod abruptly smashed down on the back of the man's neck. Even though Li Nanheng didn't make a sound, Feng Ling knew that the back of his neck was the most vulnerable part. When the man turned around with her in his arms, he staggered for a moment, but in the next instant, he held her firmly and did not let her fall. Feng Ling didn't have the slightest bit of strength to do anything. She could only watch as the man's face turned much paler in the dark night. However, he held her with one hand and pulled out the steel rod with the other, directly smashing it down on the head of the person by the car. Chapter 1035. Ah, mother asterisk cur. The person whose head was smashed cried out in pain. His face was covered in blood as he raised the stick in his hand and rushed forward. Feng Ling could barely keep her eyes open, but she tried her best to stay awake. She could only feel that everything in front of her was spinning. Even though Li Nanheng was only holding her with one arm, he was still very stable. While holding her and dodging, she could still feel his nimble footsteps as he fought back. Even if she was a big burden in his arms, he just carried a 90-kilogram sandbag in his arms like when he was training in the base. He made sure that the sandbag in his arms would not be hurt when he fought with others, that the sandbag would not leak, and that he and the sandbag in his arms would be intact. All of this was obviously quite simple for Li Nanheng, especially when the three opponents were just ordinary people. They only had steel rods and knives in their hands. Even if they had guns, they were obviously not good guns. Because of this, Feng Ling was not worried that the man would be injured because of her. However, after all, he had been hit by a steel rod on the back. She didn't know how his injury was. Although she felt that his movements were not slow, Feng Ling still looked at the man who had been holding her firmly in his arms and said softly, "Don't get hurt." Li Nanheng kicked back again and vaguely heard the low warning in his arms. He took a moment to look down at her, only to see that Feng Ling leaned her head against his chest and closed her eyes from time to time because of the knockout powder. He smiled slightly and held the woman more firmly. He dodged the man who rushed over with a knife and slashed back with one hand, knocking the knife in the man's hand to the ground. He then picked up the steel rod in his hand and hit the man's shoulder, arm and abdomen several times. In just 3 to 5 minutes, Feng Ling felt that Li Nanheng didn't need to retreat at all. The deformed car behind him was enough for him to support himself. He carried her and rolled over the car. He then placed Feng Ling, who was frowning because of the dizziness, on the ground. He got up and grabbed one of the men's wrist. In an instant, there was only the sound of bones cracking and the man's heart-wrenching scream. Then the man hit the man's abdomen hard with his elbow until he spat out blood from his mouth. The man threw him to the other two men in disgust. He fell to the ground, staggered, struggled, and then lay there without the strength to move again. His broken wrist trembled on the ground and he groaned in great pain. When the other two saw this, they were about to pull out their guns, but they didn't expect that at the same time, the man in front of them, who was obviously at a disadvantage in a one-on-one fight, had already raised a gun and was pointing it at their heads. The two of them stared at the black muzzle in disbelief. Then they glanced at their comrade who was twitching in pain on the ground. That gun. Did he snatch it from him when he was beating up their comrade? What a fast hand speed. Seeing that even the gun was in his hand, the two men looked back at the deformed car behind them and then at the man on the ground. At the same time, because of their injuries, they hesitated and took 2 steps back. This group of people only had conflicts with the Chin family in Boston and had nothing to do with 11 Base or the people in Los Angeles. They didn't know who the man in front of them was, but instinctively felt that they shouldn't fight anymore. They should run. Otherwise, not only would they fail to complete the mission, but the 3 of them would also die here tonight. Li Nanheng looked coldly at the 2 men who had begun to retreat, and his men had begun to pull the trigger on the gun. The 2 men were so frightened that their legs turned to jelly and they took a few steps back. They clenched the steel bars and knives in their hands and hesitated whether to pull out their guns or run away, when Li Nanheng suddenly shot one of them in the wrist. As the man screamed and the steel bar in his hand fell to the ground with a clang, Li Nanheng's eyes were cold. Get out. Even if it was just a very light word, the 3 men who were injured to different degrees felt a chill in their hearts. The 2 men endured the great pain of their wounds, pulled up their companion on the ground, and then looked at the gun in Li Nanheng's hand in horror. There were still a few bullets in the gun. They knew very well that if this man wanted to kill them, none of them could escape. When the three men rolled and crawled along the road and limped away, Li Nanheng looked in their direction coldly, put down the gun and looked back at Feng Ling, who was sitting against the deformed car with her eyes open and closed. Although Feng Ling couldn't stay awake, she could feel that she was basically out of danger now. She opened her eyes again and saw that the man had come back. When he bent down, he carried her in his arms without saying a word. She leaned against his arms, pressed her head weakly against his shoulder and closed her eyes. She wanted to speak but couldn't muster the strength. The man expressionlessly carried her past the deformed car and walked back to the black Hummer, which only had a slightly damaged door. He carried her in, placed her in the passenger seat and helped her fasten the seatbelt. Feng Ling sat there and opened her eyes to look at him. The man didn't speak. After fastening the seatbelt for her, he took off his coat and folded it into a long square to cushion the back of her neck. This way, when she could barely sit still, she could lean more comfortably. Perhaps he didn't expect that Li Nanheng, who had a rough personality, would be so meticulous in taking care of others. Feng Ling glanced at him and the man had already closed the car door. It wasn't until the man walked around the car and sat in the driver's seat that Feng Ling turned to look at him, but from this angle she could only see the man's firm chin and his cold, slightly pale face. Although the paleness was not very obvious, it was impossible for him to not feel the blow on the back of his neck. After all, she was almost kidnapped. After all, she had just been saved by him. Right now, she couldn't say anything to save face or thank him. She just looked at him until the man started the engine and took her away from the road, away from the car that had been completely deformed. The tall black Hummer sped on the road. At this moment, Feng Ling's entire body had relaxed. She allowed the drug that had been keeping her awake to take effect again and closed her eyes to fall asleep. I want to chat with more like-minded people about Rebirth of a Warm Marriage, Sweet Wife, new release, about life and looking for a confidant. Chapter 1036. When Feng Ling woke up again, she had already returned to her bed at home. Her head was still a little dizzy, but at least it was only the after-effect of the drug and she did not feel much pain. She sat up on the bed and looked around. Then, she lowered her head and saw that the clothes she was wearing had not changed. It was still the one she was wearing when she was knocked out and kidnapped. At that time, she had just taken a shower and changed into a loose and comfortable set of clothes. This was the one she was wearing. She got out of bed and walked out of the bedroom. Every room was empty and there was no trace of Li Nanheng. If it weren't for the fact that she was still a little dizzy and the smell of the drug still lingered in her nose, she would have thought that what happened before was just a nightmare and nothing had happened. However, it was not a dream. Feng Ling thought for a while, walked out, opened the door and looked at the door next door. She saw that the door was closed and she could not see any movement inside. She stood in front of the door for a long time and then turned to look at the night outside the window. She must have slept not long after being sent back. The sky was still dark and it was now 2:30 in the morning. If it weren't for the fact that Feng Ling was suddenly drugged, she might have been able to deal with this kind of sudden kidnapping, but after all, she was drugged. If it weren't for Li Nanheng's timely arrival, she didn't know where she would be now. But after all, when she was in 11 base, she had encountered situations several times more dangerous than tonight. This kind of small matter was obviously not worth mentioning to Li Nanheng. So it seemed that there was no need for her to thank him. Feng Ling silently took a step back and was about to close the door when her hand paused. In her mind, the deformed car door was suddenly kicked open by the man, and the man rushed into the car to pick her up and turned to leave. Because he had to take care of her, he could only turn around and was hit hard by the rod. Although that kind of steel rod wouldn't be life-threatening as long as he was properly guarded, the rod had hit a very vulnerable and fatal place on the back of his neck. If Li Nanheng hadn't dodged in time, he might have been knocked unconscious by that blow. No matter what, the place that was hit wouldn't be a light injury. Feng Ling's hand paused on the doorknob for a moment. A moment later, she walked out and was about to knock on the door next door when she suddenly heard the door behind her close automatically. Feng Ling, she looked back at the door of her house behind her. She seemed to have forgotten to bring her keys with her. Feng Ling stood alone in the corridor under the automatic sensor lights. After a moment of silence, she walked over and knocked on the door. After knocking a few times, it was still very quiet inside. Then she knocked again. About half a minute later, she heard footsteps coming from the other side of the door until the door was opened. The man inside the door had already showered and changed his clothes. His hair was clean and fluffy and he looked like he was ready to sleep. He only glanced at her outside the door. Without saying a word, he let go of the door and turned to walk in. Seeing that he intended to let her in, Feng Ling couldn't go home right now. After all, she didn't bring her keys. If she wanted to go back, she would probably have to ask Li Nanheng for his backup key. She walked in and stared at the man's back. She was not in the mood to observe the decoration and environment of his room. She didn't care whether this house was rented or bought by him. These were not the focus of her attention. Is the injury serious? She walked in and closed the door, then went straight to the point. Li Nanheng casually picked up a box of cigarettes on the coffee table, tilted his head and lit it. He then looked back at her and asked as though nothing had happened, "What injury?" Feng Ling walked over and stood about a meter in front of the man. She looked at his face that was still slightly pale even after taking a shower and resting for a while. Even through the white disguise he spat out to cover up everything, she could still see it clearly. "Although I was drugged at the time, my mind was still clear. The blow you received wasn't light." "Is that so?" Li Nanheng narrowed his eyes and took another puff of his cigarette. He said disapprovingly, "There are no wounds or blood. It's a small injury. It's not worth mentioning." Feng Ling looked at him coldly. "Do you think I'm a 3-year-old child again? If it's just a superficial wound that can see blood, it might be better, but this kind of blow from a steel rod is all below the skin. If it's the weak part behind the neck, it's very likely that you'll be crippled. Why can't I just dodge? Even if I fall down, I won't die. Have you ever thought that you might be killed by that blow?" Li Nanheng glanced at her, his expression calm. "Even if I die, I won't let you fall down." Feng Ling looked at him speechlessly. "I won't be touched. And I know." The man took another puff of his cigarette. His expression was deep, as though he knew how heartless and unscrupulous she was. Feng Ling glanced at his home clothes and said softly, "Take off your clothes. Let me take a look." Li Nanheng's brows moved slightly in the white disgust. "You want me to take off my clothes?" Feng Ling's gaze was impatient. She said coldly, "Let me take a look at your injury." The man did not move. He just stood there quietly and curved his lips lightly. "There's no need to look. I said it's a small injury. There's nothing to see." Li Nanheng, as a man, don't dawdle. "I just want to take a look. I didn't say I would be responsible for your injury. You have to at least let me know. After all, it's the back of the neck." Feng Ling lost her patience and stepped forward to tug at his clothes. However, the moment the woman suddenly approached, Li Nanheng lowered his eyes to look at her. When she suddenly raised her hand to tug at his clothes, the man grabbed her hand and pressed it against his chest. Feng Ling faltered. She could feel the temperature of the man's body through a layer of clothes. It was clearly a normal body temperature, but for some reason, it was so hot that her entire hand and arm seemed to be burning. She rushed to pull her hand out, but the man pressed her hand heavily. He held her with one hand and put the other in his trouser pocket. With half a cigarette in his mouth, he narrowed his eyes and looked at her through the smoke. He looked extremely roguish. "Then all the more you can't look. If you say you want to be responsible for me, I'll take off my clothes for you to see now. Since you said you won't be responsible, why should I take off my clothes? Do you think I like to take off my clothes in front of women?" Li Nanheng seemed to be smiling as he spoke with the cigarette in his mouth. Chapter 1037. Li Nanheng sneered. He took the cigarette out of his lips and put it out in the ashtray beside him. At the same time he said, "You weren't a woman in front of me at that time. 1 second to remember? There's no pop-up window for free reading. Feng Ling. There's no difference between now and the past. You can treat me as a man." "There's a difference." Perhaps the man was still affected by the injury on his neck, or perhaps he hadn't rested well, or perhaps because he had just smoked, his voice was low and hoarse. Feng Ling couldn't be bothered to argue with him, nor could she be bothered to ask him what the difference was. The man said hoarsely, "Right now you're a woman and the woman I like." The sudden confession might be a fatal blow, but Feng Ling said expressionlessly, "As a married man, aren't you ashamed to say such words?" Li Nanheng raised his brows. "How many times do I have to say it? I'm not married anyone. From the beginning to the end there's only you. Can't you believe me?" Feng Ling remained expressionless. "I'm not interested in your matters. Right now I just want to see your injury. Don't talk to me about useless things." Li Nanheng immediately smiled. His handsome face was slightly pale, but his smile actually looked a little harmless. "I just saved you. I didn't ask you to repay me with your body. Can't you say something nice?" Feng Ling remained expressionless. "You personally killed the enemy and saved many members of 11 Base. Does everyone have to repay you with their bodies?" Li Nanheng choked. For the first time in his life he found that Feng Ling, this adorable and stupid little wolf girl who came out of the jungle, could have such a sharp tongue. There were even times when he couldn't refute her for a while. The man suddenly turned his head away and sighed. He looked at her and said, "I don't need you to do anything. At least give me a smile, okay? Aren't you tired of talking with a stiff face? There's nothing funny if I can't smile." Feng Ling didn't want to talk nonsense with him. While he was about to turn to sit on the sofa, she suddenly reached out and pulled a large piece of his shirt down. In an instant, the bruise on the back of the man's neck extended from his neck to more than half of the wound on his back. Li Nanheng paused because of her movement. He glanced sideways at her stiffly standing behind him. After making sure that she had seen what she wanted to see, he tugged his clothes up and turned back to look at her. "I said it's just a small injury, but you insist on seeing it. Do you want to make yourself uncomfortable?" Feng Ling did not speak. She turned back to look at the things in his room and then saw the phone by the side. "Dr. Wen and Dr. Qin are not in Boston. Should I call a doctor over to take a look at you, or go directly to the hospital? How serious are the injuries? You still need to see a doctor? At least the blood clot is serious. The back of the neck is not an ordinary place. If the blood clot is serious, there may be other effects. If it did, I would have called the doctor." Li Nanheng said calmly, "I'm still young and haven't married the woman I like. I don't want to die so early. If there's a problem, I'll solve it myself. There's no need to wait for you to wake up. Don't worry, In." Feng Ling ignored the vague meaning in his words. She looked around the place where he lived and said, "Do you have a medicine box here?" "No." "Then I'll go buy some medicine and apply some medicine for you." With that, she turned to go out but suddenly paused. She remembered that she didn't bring her keys, phone, or money. She didn't even wear a coat. How could she go out in the middle of the night? She stood stiffly for a moment but was too embarrassed to say that she forgot to bring her keys. She fell into a dilemma. Li Nanheng didn't stop her. After all, she specially came here in the middle of the night. If she didn't help him apply some medicine, she would feel guilty and couldn't sleep well. However, seeing that she suddenly paused, the man watched for a moment and raised his handsome brows. "You forgot to bring your keys?" Feng Ling. After a moment of silence, she suddenly heard a chuckle from the man's chest. Feng Ling instantly furrowed her brows and abruptly turned around. However, she didn't know when the man had approached. Her face abruptly brushed against the man's chest. She was unable to stand properly and stumbled backward. The man reached out to hold her and pressed her firmly into his embrace. However, the moment Feng Ling was abruptly pulled into the man's arms, she breathed in the scent of his freshly showered body and abruptly pushed him away. She took 2 steps back to maintain the proper distance and said with an ugly expression, "Give me the key, you made a backup." Li Nanheng looked at his empty arms and then at Feng Ling, who had quickly moved away. He sighed and put down his hand. "When I sent you back to your room to rest, I left the key on the coffee table in your room. I don't have any backup keys here. Do you think I'll believe you?" Feng Ling coldly glanced at him. "Didn't you say you copied 10 keys?" Li Nanheng sneered. "You believe such nonsense. Why don't you believe me when I say something else?" "What other words? For example, I didn't marry any other woman." Feng Ling directly looked away from his face. "It's not about whether I believe it or not. It has nothing to do with me." With that, she walked out. "It doesn't matter if you don't have the key. There are some simple blood circulation and wound medicine in the convenience store downstairs. I often buy things there and know them. It's not a big deal for me to go on credit." It was not much money to buy medicine. She would rather go to someone else to buy it on credit with a smile than to say a word to him. Even if she wanted to use his wallet for a while, she would not say a word. Li Nanheng looked at her back. When Feng Ling had already walked to the door, he said, "The wallet next to the clothes rack at the door. Take it yourself." Feng Ling walked to the door and glanced at the place he said. Sure enough, she saw a black wallet. She hesitated for a second, picked it up, took out 2 bills from it and walked out. Although it was cold outside, she only took the elevator down and asked the security guard to go to the convenience store opposite to buy some medicine. She didn't need to go out, so the medicine was bought smoothly. Feng Ling returned with the medicine and saw that Li Nanheng's door was not closed. She looked at her closed door again. She didn't know if he had the key. If he didn't, would she have to stay with him for the whole night? And tomorrow was the weekend. Chapter 1038. The corridor outside the door was still a little cold. After standing for a while, Feng Ling felt a little cold. She had no choice but to pass by her closed door and walk to the half-open door next door. She actually went downstairs to ask the security guard to buy medicine for her. It took her no more than 20 minutes, but it was clear that Li Nanheng was really sleepy. He sat on the sofa to wait for her, but when she entered the door, she saw that the man had fallen asleep on the sofa. Although he was asleep, the man was still leaning against the sofa. His face was slightly paler than usual, but there was no change in his expression. It was as though the wound on the back of his neck was not a serious injury and he didn't take it seriously at all. However, Feng Ling had learned the structure of many parts of the human body in 11 base and knew the most vulnerable parts of the human body. The back of the neck was very fatal. Even if he didn't die, he would definitely faint. Even if he didn't faint, he would definitely be affected to a certain extent. She couldn't just ignore it and had to check it carefully. She wanted to take the opportunity to help him apply medicine to see if the injury was serious. But he actually fell asleep just like that. She walked in and placed the medicine on the coffee table. She stood by the sofa. Although she didn't want to look, there seemed to be nothing related to her in this room. She stood by the side and her eyes finally fell on the man. After watching for a while, Feng Ling walked over, took the neatly folded thin blanket by the sofa, gently shook it and then covered him with it. The man didn't open his eyes, but when the thin blanket covered him, his brows moved almost imperceptibly. Seeing that he didn't wake up, Feng Ling hesitated for a moment before picking up the medicine. She squeezed some ointment onto her hand and then turned to look at the man who had been sleeping. She carefully tugged open the collar of his home clothes and carefully smeared the ointment onto the back of his neck bit by bit. His head was slightly tilted while he was sleeping, and she carefully smeared the ointment onto the back of his neck. However, in this position she could only apply the ointment to the small area behind his neck and couldn't apply it to the other parts of his back. Feng Ling gently pushed the man's body but didn't want to wake him up. After looking down at him for a while, she suddenly got up from the sofa with a cold expression and took a step back. "If you're awake, turn around. I'll apply medicine for you." Li Nanheng opened his eyes and looked at this observant girl. In the end, he did not say a word and only turned his head slightly to cooperate with her. Seeing that he actually cooperated, the words that Feng Ling had prepared to scold him choked back in her throat. But he was pretending to be asleep. How could he pretend to be asleep when he knew she was applying medicine for him? Crazy. Feng Ling complained in her heart but didn't show it on her face. She took the ointment with an ugly expression and was about to tear his clothes open a little more. However, the man sitting on the sofa suddenly untied the collar of his clothes and casually took off his shirt. "Ah." Feng Ling's eyes lit up and then she said, "Ah." Feng Ling watched as the man suddenly leaned lazily against the sofa, revealing his perfect upper body. Her hand that was holding the ointment inexplicably trembled. Her gaze landed on the man's abdominal muscles and chest muscles, then moved up his arms and finally landed on his back. The wound that was clearly caused by the steel rod immediately attracted her full attention. She had clearly seen him take off his clothes before. She also admitted that when he didn't treat her as a woman, he often walked in front of her with his upper body bare. It wasn't like she hadn't seen it before. Why did she feel a little awkward now? She leaned over and bent down to check the wound on his back. As she smeared the ointment on his back with her fingers, she forcefully poked back and forth at all the vulnerable acupoints near his wound. Feeling the care and probing under her movements, Li Nanheng leaned against the sofa and closed his eyes to enjoy the coolness of the ointment and the strength of her soft hands stroking his back. He then felt the pain under her fingers and smiled lightly. "Don't poke me. I said it didn't hurt your vital parts. Whether it was many years ago, now, or in the future, you have to remember to believe every word I say." Feng Ling did not speak. After confirming that he was really fine and that it was really just subcutaneous tissue damage and blood clots, she was relieved and applied the ointment on his wound. "Lean your shoulder a little more to the left." "I can't apply it here," Feng Ling said with her head lowered. The man cooperatively moved his shoulder to the side. When she was finally done, Feng Ling twisted the lid of the ointment and was about to turn to wipe the remaining ointment on her fingers. However, when she turned to leave from the sofa, the man who had been obediently leaning against the sofa reached back and abruptly held her wrist. Feng Ling paused and turned back to look at him. At this moment the man also turned back. As the ointment on his back had yet to dry, he could not lean against the sofa for the time being, so he sat, held her wrist and looked at her. Time passed second by second. Feng Ling's eyes did not waver. Because he was injured, she did not struggle and only said, "Let go." Of course Li Nanheng did not let go. He only looked at her. "Stay here with me tonight?" His words made her instantly think of the real problem. She did not bring the key. Feng Ling tugged her hand out of his palm, turned away from the sofa, threw the ointment back on the coffee table, and then took out a tissue to wipe the remaining ointment on her fingers. As she wiped it, she walked around the coffee table to the other side, still maintaining a suitable distance from him, and then threw the tissue into the wastebasket by the side without replying. Li Nanheng sat on the sofa and did not move. Looking at her distant appearance, he said, "I really don't have another backup key here. It's not a suitable time to ask someone to open the lock for you at this time. I'll ask someone to open the lock tomorrow morning. For now, sleep here first. It's only a few hours before dawn." "I won't sleep." Feng Ling glanced at the time. "If you want to sleep, go ahead. I'll just sit in the living room for a while." Li Nanheng looked at her motionlessly with his ink-like deep eyes. "I'll sit with you." "No need." Feng Ling looked at the man's pale face. "You're injured. You should rest." "I just slept, so I'm not sleepy now. Besides, I can't sleep well in an unfamiliar environment. Even if there's only a wall between us, this is not my place. Can you let me sit here for a while? I want to be alone." Chapter 1039. Li Nanheng didn't move and still sat there. "And then I'll stay here with you." Feng Ling glanced at him. "Didn't you hear the point?" "What?" "I said I want to be alone." Li Nanheng looked at her for a while and then seemed a little embarrassed. He coughed and picked up the clothes on the sofa and slowly put them on. It seemed that his back was really hurting. When he put on the sleeves, he didn't take them off as quickly as before. After his arm froze for a while, seeing that Feng Ling had no intention of helping him put on his clothes, he finally put them on by himself. "You can cover the thin blanket on the sofa. If it's not warm enough, there is a bed and a quilt in the next room." Li Nanheng stood up. After all, he knew that Feng Ling had no patience for him now. It was useless for him to adopt the previous aggressive method. He could only take it slow and not rush at all. Feng Ling didn't reply. After he stood up, she picked up the thin blanket on the sofa, folded it, and put it aside as if she wouldn't cover what he had covered. Li Nanheng felt a breath stuck in his chest. He looked at her and raised his hand to move his arm gently. After pulling the wound on his back, his face turned pale again. Feng Ling glanced at him. "Why aren't you resting? Why are you walking around me? If you mind me being here, I'll go out now. It doesn't matter if I stand in the corridor for a few hours." Even if he wanted to stay a little longer, he couldn't. Li Nanheng looked at her sullenly. He wanted to speak, but Feng Ling looked away and didn't look at him anymore. Damn it, Li Nanheng had never met such a difficult person in his life, and she was even a woman. "Rest early." After the man finished speaking, he no longer waved his arm in front of her and turned to return to the bedroom. The living room returned to silence. The man's strong, clear, and unique scent finally left. Feng Ling finally felt that she could breathe deeply. After sitting on the sofa for a while, she lay down on the sofa. Although the surrounding environment and the living room looked unfamiliar, she didn't seem to be particularly uncomfortable. The drug had not completely dissipated, and in fact, her head was still hurting. She lay there for a while, looking at the simple and clean living room and then at the snow-white walls. In her mind, she was suddenly woken up by the car and rolled out of the back seat. When she woke up, she saw Li Nanheng pull open the deformed car door and jump in. No matter how long he closed his eyes, he couldn't erase that scene from his mind. In the end, Feng Ling turned over on the sofa and forced her head into the corner of the sofa. The next morning, Feng Ling didn't know how long she had slept. In short, she couldn't sleep at first. Later, she fell asleep in a daze, but she still had a lot of dreams. It had been a long time since he had had so many dreams. It wasn't until daybreak that he finally managed to sleep soundly. There seemed to be a faint smell of food in the air. It was very light and a little strange. It was really strange. Because of this smell, she had to open her eyes. When she saw that it was daybreak, she followed the direction of the smell to the kitchen door. From this angle, she could only see a corner of the man's back. Feng Ling looked in that direction in confusion. She got up and walked over. When she arrived at the kitchen door, she saw that a patient who had been hit by a stick yesterday was standing in the kitchen. He broke 2 eggs and put them on a plate. Then he used chopsticks and stirred the eggs awkwardly. When she saw the man turn on the rice cooker by the side, she saw that there was porridge inside. However, the porridge seemed to have less water. It was very dry, as though he had accidentally added too much water to cook rice. When she saw the man pour the eggs into the frying pan, Feng Ling couldn't stand it anymore. She walked over. "What are you doing?" The man flipped the egg pancake in the pot with his chopsticks and glanced at her. "Why don't you sleep a little longer?" Feng Ling looked at the miserable egg pancake in the pot. "The smell is a little strange. Get up to take a look." The smell is strange? Feng Ling glanced at the thing in his pot. What else is there besides oil? I put some honey in it. Don't all girls like sweet food? I created a honey fried egg pancake. Feng Ling, in the past she knew that young Master Li was good at everything except cooking. When she lived in his apartment she had eaten the food he cooked personally several times. How should she put it? It was cooked and wouldn't hurt her stomach, but the taste was very terrible. It was so terrible that except for someone like her who grew up in a wolf pack, it should be difficult for others to swallow. But she didn't expect that after more than 2 years he didn't grow at all. Are you going to make breakfast? Feng Ling asked. Li Nanheng gave her a, do I look like I'm making dinner? Expression. Feng Ling pursed her lips and suddenly reached out to take the frying pan from his hand. Move aside. Don't block me. Seeing that Feng Ling seemed to want to show off her skills in the kitchen, Li Nanheng very consciously moved aside. She then washed the pot and placed it on the stove again. She poured some water in and then cracked 2 eggs in. A minute or 2 later, 2 perfect poached eggs were placed on the plate by the side. She looked at Feng Ling and saw that Feng Ling had skillfully poured out the eggs in the pot that could no longer be eaten. She then scrubbed the pot and placed it on the stove again. Looking at the 2 golden poached eggs, Li Nanheng looked at Feng Ling's hand, and then watched her skillfully add water in the rice cooker to boil the rice again. Your cooking skills were very ordinary before. Where did you learn to cook? Feng Ling continued to busy herself and did not look back at him. She replied coldly, I'm not a young master like you. Even if you leave the base, there will be people who will find ways to come to your door every day to take care of your daily life. I can't eat takeout every day. 2 years is enough for me to learn how to cook. Is it strange? Li Nanheng saw that she was indeed more skilled than when she cooked 2 years ago. Standing by the side, watching her movements, the corners of his mouth inadvertently curved up. Feng Ling really couldn't stand his cooking skills. The food clearly didn't taste good and he was injured. What on earth was he doing in the kitchen early in the morning? She didn't say that she would have breakfast here. Would she eat it even if he cooked it? And it tasted so bad. She tidied up the things in the kitchen, prepared the other ingredients and prepared a few good dishes for breakfast. She was about to take the plates to the dining table outside when she suddenly saw that the man had been watching her by the side. Feng Ling suddenly paused and raised her eyes to see that the man was looking at her as though he was looking at a little wife. Chapter 1040. Only then did Feng Ling realize what she was doing. She was making breakfast in his kitchen? She even made 2 servings. She abruptly put down the plate in her hand, turned and walked out. Li Nanheng looked at her suddenly changed expression and raised his eyebrows. What's wrong? If you want to eat, eat by yourself. I'm not hungry. It's almost time. I'll call a locksmith over to help me unlock the door. With that she walked out. Go after breakfast. I'm not eating. Li Nanheng did not speak, but his hand had already clasped her shoulder and pulled her back from the kitchen door. When Feng Ling turned to look at him impatiently because of his movements and strength, the man only said, There's no hurry to leave after breakfast. I'll call someone over to unlock the door. You don't have to go downstairs to find the security guard. Feng Ling glanced at the phone he placed not far away. When she left the room last night she did not bring her phone with her. If she went to find the security guard now she didn't know how efficient they would be. Would they be able to find a reliable locksmith? She glanced at the time. It's time to find someone. Go sit down at the dining table. I'll make the call, Li Nanheng said as he patted her back. Don't worry, go eat breakfast. How can you not eat the breakfast you made yourself? You made so much. How can I finish it alone? I don't remember you being the kind of person who likes to waste food. What? Have you been living too freely in the past 2 years? Have you become so arrogant that you'll waste the breakfast you made? Feng Ling did not understand his words for a moment. When she came back to herself, the man had already pressed her to the dining table. She looked at the breakfast that the man brought up on the table. The breakfast that she had personally cooked. She was silent for a moment, picked up the cutlery, picked up a golden, perfectly fried egg, and put it into the plate in front of her. She took a bite. Li Nanheng picked up his cell phone to make a call and came back less than 3 minutes later. He pulled out the chair opposite the dining table and sat down. As he picked up the tableware, he said indifferently, I've already contacted someone. They'll be here in half an hour. Eat in peace. She didn't expect that she had unknowingly made so much. Although she had finally learned how to cook in the past 2 years, she actually made very little. She really didn't expect that someone like her who hated the kitchen would one day use such a calm and patient attitude to make breakfast, and it was very sumptuous and complicated. What was she thinking? The breakfast was indeed delicious, but no matter how Li Nanheng praised it, Feng Ling sat there pretending not to hear him. She did not raise her head or look at him. A few minutes after breakfast, the locksmith arrived. Hearing that the person had arrived, Feng Ling immediately got up and walked out as if she was liberated. She opened the door and went out without looking back. The locksmith that Li Nanheng hired for her was a locksmith company that had a cooperative relationship with the police station in Boston. They were very fast and efficient. After asking the reason why the door was locked and confirming that her cell phone and information were in the room, they opened the door in less than a few minutes, and the lock on the door was still intact. Feng Ling wanted to pay before they left, but they were so scared that they quickly waved their hands and said, "We can't accept this money. Although locksmithing is paid work, Mr. Li specially called the police station today, and the leader of the police station specially sent us here. It can be seen that your identity must be very unusual. We don't dare to accept money from Mr. Li's friend. It's just to open the lock." Seeing that they really refused to accept it, Feng Ling didn't force them. She chatted with them for a while and sent them away. When all those people were gone, she suddenly caught a glimpse of the door next door that had been closed at this time. In fact, they didn't spend much time together last night. At least when he listened to her and went to the bedroom to rest, she had been on the sofa. At least when she woke up, he was in the kitchen. Nothing happened. Let alone flirting, they didn't even have a slightly warm conversation. Anyway, his injuries weren't too serious. Forget it, she had already applied the medicine for him. She had already thanked him. There was nothing to say. Feng Ling closed the door. Today happened to be the weekend, and there were classes after 2 o'clock on the weekend. The first few hours were her vacation time. Feng Ling wanted to make up for her sleep in the morning, but she couldn't fall asleep, so she simply balanced on the carpet in the living room for 2 minutes. When her flesh and bones seemed to be exhausted, she lay on the ground weakly, letting the sweat drip down from her forehead. After resting like this for a long time, she stood up from the ground, picked up a towel, and went straight into the bathroom. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Feng Ling changed into the clothes she often wore when she went to the martial arts club. She didn't go to call Li Nanheng. After all, he was injured, and this injury was caused by her. If he didn't come when the class was about to begin, she could help him ask the boss for a leave. While thinking, Feng Ling stood in the elevator and looked up at the slowly descending number of the elevator. When the elevator reached the first floor, when she was about to go out, a man and a woman suddenly came in. They looked about 30 years old. Feng Ling didn't look back at them. After walking out of the elevator, she was about to leave in her flat sneakers, quiet and harmless as if she were a completely different person from the excellent Feng Ling who used to be in the sniper team of 11 base. When the two people walked into the elevator, they just casually glanced at her and then stood at the back of the elevator. One of the men pressed the elevator button. The wall of the elevator was a mirror. Feng Ling felt something was wrong, but she couldn't tell what was wrong. She subconsciously turned back and suddenly saw the red number on the elevator reflected on the mirror wall before the elevator door closed. Why was it on the floor where she and Li Nanheng lived? This apartment was a 2-unit structure, and there were only 2 families on each floor. The 2 people looked very unfamiliar and had Chinese skin, but their eyes seemed a little fierce. Although it was not obvious, Feng Ling could sense what was hidden in a person's heart. These 2 people were very dangerous. The moment Feng Ling's footsteps suddenly stopped outside the elevator door, she abruptly turned back. In the last gap before the elevator door closed, she saw the outline of a special gun handle under the 2 men's clothes. Chapter 1041. Feng Ling did. Others couldn't recognize the outline, but Feng Ling did. Her eyelids twitched violently. The 2 of them had guns and their aim was precisely on that floor. But they obviously didn't know her. So who were they after? The answer was obvious. Seeing that the elevator door had closed, Feng Ling's footsteps paused. Then she abruptly walked to the safety passage not far away and rushed up the escalator. Relying on the physical strength that she had trained for many years, she ran to the 14th floor in one breath and jumped out of the window on the 14th floor. In modern buildings, especially in the United States, high-rise buildings would have an external fire escape on the 14th floor, which was equivalent to a long public balcony. Feng Ling hid on the 14th floor along this fire escape and looked up. She and Li Nanheng lived on the 15th floor, which was only 2 or 3 meters away from the window of Li Nanheng's room. In the room, Li Nanheng's back had been hurting all night, so he raised his arm and moved it twice. Although it was not a big problem, the hit on the back of his neck was enough to make him not dare to move too much. He had to rest for at least a few days and he couldn't do any strenuous exercise in the next few days. Suddenly his cell phone rang. The man picked up the cell phone, saw the caller ID, frowned and picked it up. "Boss, the remaining members of the drug gangs that we encircled in Los Angeles 3 months ago have appeared again. They have contacted their accomplices all over the country and are lurking everywhere. They can't enter 11 base, but they are likely to find your trace. Boss, you must be careful. Where are you now? We'll send someone to protect you right away." On the phone, as soon as the voice of a member of 11 base fell, there was a knock on the door. At this time, Feng Ling had already left, and if there was no reason, she would never come knocking on his door. Hearing the knock on the door, Li Nanheng said indifferently to the phone by his ear, "They have come. It's too late." With that, he hung up the phone, turned around, picked up the sports coat on the sofa and put it on, covering the wound on his back in the back of his neck. At the same time, he took out a silencer gun from under the sofa cushion and threw it into his trouser pocket. He walked directly to the door and leaned against it, listening to the sounds of knocking on the door and the movements outside. The knocking lasted for about 2 minutes and it suddenly became quiet outside. Li Nanheng put one hand in his trouser pocket, stroked the handle of the gun, and his eyes were cold. After about a minute, the knocking on the door continued, but it was no longer as strong and rhythmic as before. It seemed that there was more than one person here. There were at least 2 of them. The one who knocked on the door just now had taken the opportunity to sneak in from another entrance. Another person knocked on the door. Judging from the strength of the knock, it should be a woman standing outside the door at this moment. From the sound and position of the knocking on the door, this woman was much taller than ordinary women. It could be seen that she had been practicing martial arts for many years and was not a simple character. At this time, Li Nanheng suddenly looked in the direction of the bedroom. There were 2 entrances to his room from the outside. One was the fire escape on the 14th floor below the bedroom, but the person was just outside the door, so it was impossible for him to go out so quickly. The other place was the balcony directly opposite the living room. They could walk along the wall of the corridor and step on the fixed air conditioner outside the wall to directly come over. It was only a short distance of more than 10 meters. For skilled people, it was very easy to go around to his outdoor balcony, and they could do it in 2 or 3 minutes. If there were 2 or more people coming, then he couldn't waste any more time. He had to deal with the woman outside before the people outside rushed in and surrounded him. Otherwise, he would be attacked from the front and back. In such a narrow room, no matter how fast he was, it was easy for him to be at a disadvantage. When the knocking on the door gradually weakened, Li Nanheng suddenly opened the door. At the moment the muzzle of the gun outside the door was pointed at his forehead, Li Nanheng instantly raised his hands and made a gesture of surrender and begging for mercy. At the same time, there was a trace of surprise in his eyes as if he didn't expect that there would be danger outside the door. He looked at the black-haired, yellow-skinned woman who looked completely Asian outside the door. The muzzle in the Asian woman's hand had been pointed straight at the center of his eyebrows. Before the door was about to close automatically, she suddenly raised her foot and stepped on the door. Holding the gun in one hand, she quickly and neatly grabbed Li Nanheng's clothes with the other hand and pressed the muzzle against his forehead. There was a cold and triumphant smile in her eyes. "Hi, we meet again, Mr. Li." Li Nanheng's eyes changed from the initial surprise to understanding and calmness, as if he had been caught by the enemy. He said in a low voice, "Lisa, long time no see." The woman called Raisha sneered and pressed the muzzle against his forehead. At the same time, she pushed him back into the room step by step, but the muzzle was still pressed against his forehead. As she walked, she said with cold and charming eyes, "Mr. Li, do you still remember my name? Do you know what I'm here for this time?" Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and smiled faintly. "Come to take my life?" Ruisha pinched the clothes on his chest, and the charm in her eyes suddenly turned into fierceness and hatred. She strode forward step by step, pressed the man who was forced to retreat against the wall near the balcony, and pressed him hard against the gun, saying coldly and angrily, "My husband was shot by you in the Philippines. My 7-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter fled with me to a war-torn country, only to die under the bombers of a war-torn country. My life was ruined by you. In the past 2 years, I followed that group of drug dealers to the edge of various countries just to make a living, but they still refused to let me go and sent your 11 base to kill me. My everything was ruined by you. Tell me, do you want me to take your life? 11 base has investigated your information. You were once a citizen of High City, China. At the age of 15 you frequented various nightclubs because of your youth and beauty. At the age of 17 you were abducted by your husband. After that, you fell into the underworld and wandered around the dark areas of various countries. You could have lived a peaceful life in High City, but you chose to take an unconventional path. This is the life you chose. Who can you blame? Please remember the domain name of this book. For mobile version website, M. Chapter 1042. Lisa glared at him and said, "Yes, it's the life I chose. But if you hadn't appeared in my life, it wouldn't have been ruined like this. It's okay that my husband is gone, but my 2 children are still so young. How are you going to return their lives to me? You clearly know that you shouldn't have given birth to children if you're wandering on the edge of darkness. It's your own choice to let the 2 children wander around with you. The law is merciless. You know what you've done. 11 base is just a sharp sword in front of the military and the police. Without me and 11 base, there will be others responsible for killing you. As for the 2 children, our people shouldn't have touched them. You should find out how they died." Lisa held his clothes tightly. They died under the bombers of war-torn countries. They were badly mutilated and their eyes were open when they died. If we weren't chased by 11 base, if we weren't cornered, we wouldn't have fled to such a dangerous country. It's all your fault. It's all your fault. He grabbed the gun in her hand and put it against her forehead, staring at her coldly. "When you were still young in High City, you had already assassinated many young and beautiful girls in the nightclub. Do you think I don't know that you are a vicious woman? Don't pretend to be affectionate in front of me. If you really love your 2 children and husband, you wouldn't be so close to the drug trafficking gang after knowing that everything has been destroyed." Lisa looked at him with red eyes. Because of his words, the tears in her eyes almost dried up in an instant. She sneered and reached out to grab the gun, but Li Nanheng just raised his hand easily. When the Asian man who broke in from the balcony pounced at him, he turned around and shot the gun in his hand. The gun fell to the ground in an instant, and the Asian man quickly rolled back, knelt on one knee on the ground, picked up the gun and rushed over again. The woman named Raisha in front of him had been in the underworld for more than 10 years. She left High City with others at the age of 17 and was now 32 years old. Her skills in all aspects were definitely not inferior to any female soldier who had been trained for many years. She also reacted very quickly. Although she didn't have a gun in her hand, there was a dagger in her sleeve that flashed with cold light and directly attacked him. Li Nanheng blocked Lisa's dagger with one hand, and at the moment the Asian man rushed over, he raised the gun and pointed it at his forehead. When the Asian man was about to avoid the muzzle of his gun, he raised his foot and kicked the lantern next to him up and smashed it at the Asian man's face. However, even if Reisa's hands were restrained, she still exerted the strength of a woman to pester him. She simply held his arm with one hand and struggled with the other hand. At the same time she lowered her head to bite him. Because of her pestering, Li Nanheng suddenly felt a sharp pain from the wound on his back. He frowned, looked coldly at the crazy woman beside him and twisted her wrist hard. When the dagger in her hand suddenly fell to the ground, he caught it with the back of his foot and kicked the Asian man who had just struggled to get up from under the lantern stand. The tip of the dagger directly pierced into the Asian man's calf, and blood instantly flowed to the ground. He is not as fast as a gun. Seeing that his arms and body moved so fast that she couldn't trap him at all, Lisa simply entangled him with her hands and feet. At the same time she found that he seemed to be injured, so she shouted, "He has a wound on his back." Hearing such a news, the Asian man endured the pain in his calf, leaned down, pulled out the dagger, stood 2 meters away from Li Nanheng and Lisa, and accurately pointed the muzzle at Li Nanheng's head. He clearly knew that he couldn't be too close to Li Nanheng. In a close fight he couldn't beat him at all. Now that Lisa was entangled with him, he could definitely blow up his head with a single shot from his current position. Li Nanheng's face was cold and gloomy. Because of the pain on his back, he couldn't successfully push Lisa away from him. Although it was only a man and a woman, these 2 people obviously knew his moves very well. Now they also knew that he was injured on his back, so he couldn't get rid of Lisa's arm. Now it was very likely that he couldn't avoid the gun because of Lisa's entanglement. Just when Li Nanheng suddenly raised his leg, bent his knee to hit Lisa's abdomen hard, pushed Lisa away a little, and was about to take out the silencer hidden in his trouser pocket, the Asian man 2 meters away had already pulled the trigger. At this critical moment, a bottle of shower gel suddenly flew over from the direction of the bedroom door and hit the Asian man's hand hard. The Asian man's shot was abruptly missed because of the bottle of shower gel. The bullet hit the wall to one side, making a loud noise and giving off the smell of gunpowder as the bullet rubbed against the wall. Li Nanheng abruptly turned his eyes to look at Feng Ling, who suddenly appeared in the direction of the bedroom. At the same time he saw a corner of the curtain fluttering because the window was opened. He immediately understood how she came in, but at the same time, He looked to the side and gave her an instruction with the special sight signal of 11 base that only Feng Ling could understand. Feng Ling didn't speak but coldly looked away from him. There was nothing else in his room. She still had a bottle of shampoo in her hand, which was heavy enough for her to use for a while. Only when she approached the Asian man and grabbed the weapon in his hand could she have more chances. The look Li Nanheng gave her was telling her that he had a gun. So, the gun that had just fallen on the ground was about to become her weapon. Because of Feng Ling's sudden intrusion, Lisa and the Asian man looked at each other. Before they came, they didn't expect that Li Nanheng would have help, but this woman seemed to have some skills. They didn't know much about 11 base in the past 2 years. This time they came here for Li Nanheng, and because they knew that Li Nanheng always acted alone this time, they came here when the opportunity was right. So, who was this woman who suddenly appeared? How did she come here? Please remember the domain name of this book. For mobile version website, M. Chapter 1043. In just a few seconds, Feng Ling quietly observed the overall situation in the room. Thankfully, she had stayed here for a night before. Even if she did not observe carefully, she knew what was placed in every position. The lamp stand by Li Nanheng's side had fallen to the ground. On her side, under the coffee table, the man and woman couldn't see because of the sofa. There was an empty fruit plate under the coffee table, and there were 2 fruit knives in the fruit plate. When the Asian man who had just injured his hand suddenly raised his gun and was about to shoot Li Nanheng, she did not rush to throw the thing in her hand. Instead, she suddenly moved forward in an unexpected posture. The Asian man was sure that this short-haired young woman who suddenly broke in was good at martial arts. Because of her movement, his fingers paused. At this moment, Feng Ling found an opportunity to lean down and pick up the fruit knife under the coffee table. She separated her hands and thrust forward. Although the fruit knife was not sharp enough, the tip was at least sharp. Because of the force she thrust forward, the tip of the knife stabbed into the back of the Asian man's hand. Ah! The Asian man groaned in pain and almost lost his grip on the gun. He quickly changed his hand and shot forward. But this time, Li Nanheng had already dodged, and at the same time, another fruit knife thrown by Feng Ling had stabbed Raisha's arm. Raisha's arm stiffened in pain, and Li Nanheng took this opportunity to slap her away. At the same time, he took out the gun in his trouser pocket and fired 3 shots at the Asian man. 1 shot hit the man's leg, 1 shot in the arm, and 1 shot in the shoulder. He aimed at him but did not directly hit his vital parts. These 2 people had important clues about the drug gangs that escaped, so he could only capture them alive. Otherwise, he would definitely shoot his head first. Raisa was pushed aside by the force of Li Nanheng's hand and stumbled to the ground. She lowered her head and saw the gun on the ground. She was about to reach out to pick it up, but someone picked it up 1 step ahead of her. Raisha suddenly raised her eyes and met Feng Ling's eyes. However, before she could see the emotions in Feng Ling's eyes at such a close distance, she was kicked to the ground by Feng Ling, and at the same time, her shoulder was hit hard by Feng Ling. Raisha groaned in pain and cursed. She had never seen a woman who was better at martial arts than her. The point was that this woman looked very petite and not big at all. The moment Feng Ling picked up the gun, she wounded Raisha, put the gun against her head and looked down at her coldly. "Don't move." Raisha sat stiffly on the ground and did not dare to move, but gripped the carpet on the ground tightly and glared at her fiercely. "Who are you?" It had been a long time since Feng Ling participated in such a battle with guns or violence. Hearing the other party's question, she was about to say her name in 11 base out of reflex, but when she was about to speak, she paused and didn't answer. She just looked at Ruisha coldly and said indifferently, "Don't worry about who I am. If you dare to move again, you will be killed by my gun. I'm afraid you can only ask the King of Hell about my name." Li Nanheng also thought that Feng Ling would say her name in 11 base, but she didn't. He also noticed that she paused for a few seconds. When the Asian man fell to the ground and twitched because he was shot, he turned his eyes to Feng Ling, who was pressing Raisha to the ground. Feeling the man's gaze, Feng Ling also turned her eyes to him at the same time. Without waiting for him to ask, she said directly, "I met them downstairs just now. I found they were suspicious and came directly to the 15th floor, so I guess they might come to seek revenge on you or some terrorist. I was worried that something would happen, so I climbed up from the fire escape on the 14th floor to have a look." Li Nanheng put the gun back into his pocket and then looked at the Asian man lying on the ground, who was not dead but had lost the ability to fight back. To avoid any mistakes, he went up and searched all over his body. After finding no extra guns or weapons, he straightened up, casually shook his stiff shoulders and back, and then looked at her, saying, "You care about me?" Feng Ling didn't answer but looked at the woman in front of her with red eyes. What should we do with this woman? Li Nanheng lowered his eyes and happened to see that Raisha was about to pick up the carpet beside her hand. When he was about to speak, Feng Ling had already kicked her in the waist. Before Raisha could lift the carpet, she suddenly lay on the ground awkwardly, and her hands were instantly removed from the corner of the carpet. Feng Ling stepped on the carpet and looked down at the woman on the ground. Should we call the police or the military? She was asking Li Nanheng. Li Nanheng glanced at the two people on the ground, thought of something and suddenly turned to look out of the window. Not far from this window, about 300 or 400 meters away, there was a 38-story financial building. Looking at the reflective glass on the top floor of the building, he raised his eyebrows and suddenly said, "Be careful. There are sniper rifles. They came prepared. There are more than 2 people." Hearing this, the Asian man lying on the ground covered in blood suddenly grinned coldly and struggled to get up from the ground, but he couldn't, but the fierceness and confidence in his eyes showed that Li Nanheng guessed right. Raisha fell to the ground, sneered and turned to look coldly at Li Nanheng. "You're right, Li Nanheng. You've been surrounded. It's not so easy to escape. I didn't expect that there would be a woman by your side who would risk her life for you. Why don't you let her die with you?" Feng Ling looked at him and didn't speak. Suddenly she felt a tight grip on her arm. She turned around with a jerk, only to see Li Nanheng suddenly came over and pulled her away. At the same time, he turned his back to the window, shielded her in his arms and pushed her out. "Go." Feng Ling turned back and was about to speak when she suddenly heard the sound of explosions coming from the 3 windows facing the financial building on the opposite side of the bedroom balcony and kitchen at the same time. This meant that there was more than one sniper on the other side but in all directions. "Li Nanheng, don't talk nonsense. Go first." Li Nanheng pushed her forward without hesitation, his back still blocking all possible directions behind her, and warned her with his eyes to leave immediately. Please remember this book's domain name. For mobile version website, M. Chapter 1044. At this time if she turned her back to the window she would die. Feng Ling staggered back to look at him, but was still pushed close to the door by the man. She looked back at the window and turned back to pull him. "Li Nanheng, let's go first." Li Nanheng seized every minute and second to ask her to go first without hesitation. "Go." Almost at that moment, Feng Ling, who was too familiar with sniper rifles, suddenly felt her eyelids twitching. Even though she was far away, she looked out of the window and shouted, "Be careful." At the moment when the sniper bullet broke through the window, Li Nanheng grabbed Feng Ling's arm and bent down with her to avoid the bullet. The bullet hit the wall again, making a loud noise, and then another shot. Seeing that Feng Ling hadn't been able to get out of the room, Li Nanheng frowned. He was worried that if Raisha and her companions were tied with small explosives, Feng Ling would be killed if she continued to stay here. However, there was no time to say or think too much. The man dragged Feng Ling to hide behind the sofa and pressed her head into his arms. The bullets outside the window came in one after another. The sound was loud, and the entire room was filled with the smell of gunpowder, completely breaking the peace of this neighborhood. Feng Ling raised her head from his arms. Li Nanheng turned back to look out of the window, then lowered his head to look at her and said in a low voice, "Their target is me. Don't get involved. Run if you can." "If I run away, what about you?" Feng Ling's hand also held his sleeve tightly. "Since you can run away, let's go out together." "I'll go out with you. How many innocent people are there outside? Don't forget the mission of 11 base. We are not crazy enough to sacrifice other innocent people to satisfy our personal heroism. We have the military and the police behind us." With that, he suddenly pulled her out of his arms. "Go." Feng Ling's hand was still holding onto his sleeve. "Let's go together?" Li Nanheng knew the stubbornness in her bones. He lowered his eyes to look at her. When the sofa behind him was filled with smoke from the bullets, he stared into her eyes and suddenly chuckled. "I won't die. Even if you want to care about me and live and die with me, you have to wait for another time. I'm afraid I can't be touched now." Feng Ling, who would want to be touched by this shameless person? She tugged at his sleeve. "Come with me." He couldn't dawdle any longer. Otherwise, the sofa, the only barrier in the hall, would be completely destroyed. Li Nanheng became serious again and was about to get up, when suddenly Rui Sha, who had been lying on the ground powerlessly, slowly moved her hand toward her calf. Bullets kept coming in from the 3 windows behind them. Even though Li Nanheng saw it, he couldn't do anything. When he pulled Feng Ling up and ran to the door, he suddenly held Feng Ling firmly in his arms and carried her out. The two of them walked very fast and tried to avoid the bullets behind them. However, when they were about to step out of the door, Rui Sha had successfully taken out the mini silencer hidden in the decorative pocket on her calf, stared at Li Nanheng and Feng Ling and quickly fired a shot. The sound of the sniper rifle was so loud that Feng Ling couldn't hear the unique muffled sound of the silencer gun. She only felt that Li Nanheng suddenly turned sideways with her in his arms, and the man who was holding her suddenly stiffened. However, when she suddenly raised her eyes to look at him, she could only see the man's cold chin but not his pale face. Then she was suddenly carried out by the man. Finally rushing out of the door, Li Nanheng took her to hide behind the wall. The man panted heavily and said, "There should be people lurking in the safe passage and the elevator. Go down alone. They don't know you and won't attack you even if they meet in the elevator." At this time, Feng Ling turned to push open the door on the side of the safe passage and went in to take a look. After checking, she turned back and was about to call him, only to see that the man's back was smeared with blood on the wall. She immediately raised her eyebrows. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine. It's just a minor injury." Li Nanheng panted again and couldn't hide the paleness on his face. He didn't even frown and smiled at her. "Be good and go." A certain action of Rui Sha just now came to Feng Ling's mind. At that time, in order to avoid the bullets of the sniper rifle outside the window, they ignored that although the gun in the Asian man's hand had fallen to the ground, the woman named Rui Sha hadn't taken out her gun. If one person carried a gun, the other person would definitely carry a gun, but she didn't take it out at that time, so they ignored the person closest to her. She didn't hear any sound and didn't find that Rui Sha had a gun, so it seemed that only a special mini silencer could do it. Feng Ling didn't say more and went forward to hold the man's arm. "Go." Li Nanheng looked at her. "I told you to go by yourself. Don't you understand?" Feng Ling looked at him coldly. "Bossly, if I were you and you were me, would you go?" "Why not? Don't you hate me and disgust me?" Li Nanheng chuckled. When he laughed, the man's eyebrows trembled slightly because of the pain in his back yesterday and the new injury, but he still held back and didn't make a sound. Looking at his pale face when he laughed, Feng Ling didn't speak with a cold face. She didn't refute or admit it, but dragged his arm hard, pushed open the door of the escalator again and dragged him in. Li Nanheng staggered a little. After being dragged in by her, he looked around the escalator. The surroundings looked calm, but based on their experience they were probably surrounded by people. It was not safe in the elevator and they might be attacked from both sides here. At this time, Feng Ling took out the gun from his body, held it in her hand and then held him down with one hand. "Go." Even if Li Nanheng had new injuries on top of old ones, he wouldn't lose to her strength, but Feng Ling insisted on holding his hand. If the two of them continued to delay, neither of them would be able to escape safely. The man who was being held by her side. "Slow down. Don't fall." At this moment, Feng Ling looked back at him. "Are you going or not?" Li Nanheng looked at her with a pale face and lips. Seeing the anger and impatience in her eyes, he sighed with a smile. "All right, I'll go. Please remember the domain name of this book. For mobile version website, M. Chapter 1045. Feng Ling glared at him again and helped him down. Whether it was the cooperation after long-term training in missions in 11 base, or the instinctive tacit understanding between the two of them now, when she saw the people lying in ambush in the corridor, Feng Ling raised the gun and hit their heads with the butt of the gun. Fortunately, although they were ambushed, they were scattered in all directions because they didn't know that Li Nanheng would suddenly have such a skilled helper like Feng Ling by his side. There were not many people lying in ambush. As long as they dealt with it well, they could be solved in a few seconds. Along the way, the two of them did not waste a single bullet and went straight out of the apartment building. When they came out, they saw that many people who lived there thought that it was a terrorist attack because of the commotion and the terrifying bullets. Many people had already escaped. There were many people coming and going in the parking lot. Everyone was running like crazy. Some carried their children or the elderly into their cars and then drove away in all directions. Such a scene was very common in the United States. Once something similar to a terrorist attack happened, the people here would immediately flee the scene to avoid being implicated as cannon fodder. It was precisely because there were so many people outside that Feng Ling could take advantage of the chaos to rush into the parking lot and find Li Nanheng's car. Because he was wearing black clothes and had a wound on his back, no one would notice it. She ran all the way to the car, searched the man's body for a long time, and finally found the electronic car key. She quickly opened the door and helped him into the passenger seat. He was helped out by this little woman. Li Nanheng glanced at the driver's seat and was about to go over when Feng Ling pressed him against the seat and buckled the seat belt in front of him. "Don't move. I'll drive." Li Nanheng glanced at her. "Do you want to die?" Of course, she understood that if those people were lying in ambush outside and were determined to target her, the first thing they would do would be to kill the person sitting in the driver's seat, no matter who that person was. Feng Ling did not speak. After fastening his seat belt, she quickly moved over and sat in the driver's seat. Under Li Nanheng's gaze, she started the engine without changing her expression, drove the car out quickly and rushed out of the ambushers. There were too many people and cars around so she could temporarily use it as a cover. After rushing out of the community because she was used to her duties and missions in 11 Base, she habitually did not drive the car onto the main road. Instead, she took a shortcut and turned into a less populated road. She drove towards the suburbs and uninhabited highways, so as not to implicate the innocent people living in the normal living area. Li Nanheng sat there without moving. He just looked at the gloomy sky outside and said, "Be careful of a pincer attack from the front and back." Feng Ling did not speak, but she was already mentally prepared. From time to time, she observed the road conditions and situation behind from the rearview mirror. After the car drove out for about a kilometer, there was already a car chasing up. "Who are these people?" Feng Ling asked coldly. "A group of drug gangs that were encircled and suppressed not long ago. The forces behind them are very powerful." Li Nanheng said in a low voice and was about to raise his hand to take something, but because of the gunshot wound on his back and the old wound caused by the stick yesterday, he frowned and put his hand down without saying a word. Feng Ling noticed his movement. "What do you want to take?" "Cell phone." She controlled the steering wheel with one hand and reached out to search his body with the other. She found the cell phone and handed it to him. Li Nanheng glanced at the thing she handed to him, took it, opened it, and quickly sent his tracking signal authority to the base hall. Then he glanced at the car that was chasing closely behind him. He closed his eyes in annoyance because he had involved Feng Ling in the end, leaned against the seat and let out a long breath. Feng Ling focused on starting, stepped hard on the accelerator, and glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. "Speak." Li Nanheng closed his eyes and said, "I really haven't married another woman." Feng Ling was silent for a moment. "There's no need to talk about this. If something is really going to happen here today, if you can leave safely, at least think of me. Don't let me die with regret, right? It's a matter of principle. I can't tell you about the 3-year agreement for the time being, but you have to believe me. I'm sincere to you and have never meant to play with your feelings." Because the man was seriously injured, and the gunshot wound on his back was not as simple as a superficial wound, his voice was a little hoarse. After bleeding for so long he probably had no strength left. Feng Ling clenched the steering wheel. 3 years? What 3-year agreement? Back then she didn't intend to ask, nor did she want to ask. Besides, when 11 Base was kicked out, she left and never thought of asking what had happened. She had always thought that it was just like what Han Jin said. It was just an unfruitful relationship. No one needed to care about it. But Miss Wen said that Li Nanheng refused to return to the Li family for her and refused to meet the elders of the Li family. He had been looking for her for 2 whole years. She looked ahead and continued to drive, her voice a little hoarse. "What do you want to explain? Wait until we are out of danger. Don't talk about dying. You can even survive a terrorist bomb zone. How can you be killed by such a small character?" "I don't remember Boss Li being such a negative person." Li Nanheng smiled. "Have you forgotten that in 11 Base, just like in the military, every time there is something or before a mission, we have to write our last words first? Right now, I only have you by my side, so I can only leave my last words to you." Feng Ling was silent for a moment. "What last words?" Li Nanheng leaned weakly on the co-pilot's seat and glanced at the cars behind him that he couldn't shake off. After more than 10 seconds, he said hoarsely and quietly, "I only have you, and you are the only woman I have ever liked. Don't you have anything else to say?" Feng Ling's hand on the steering wheel tightened. "No, my life is very simple. Except for the Li family, the base, there is only you," the man said with a soft sigh. Then he suddenly sighed with a smile and turned to look out of the car window. Feng Ling drove very fast. This Hummer could be driven at its limit. In a short time they had driven very close to the suburbs. Outside the car window was an endless plain and American farm. Because it was winter, the plain was full of yellow autumn colors. It was lonely and quiet, and there was no end in sight. Only the car kept driving forward. Please remember the original domain name of this book. For mobile version website, M. Chapter 1046. Feng Ling didn't speak all the way, just observing everything in the rearview mirror, and suddenly said, "There are inhabited areas ahead. We can't drive over. I know there is a jungle near the east of Boston. It's about 50 kilometers from here. These people are chasing us closely and have made full preparations. Do you mind if I drive the car into the jungle?" The jungle was an extremely dangerous area for others, but it was very simple for Feng Ling. If she wanted to deal with these people who had been chasing them, it might be the only best way out for the time being. But Li Nanheng's injuries couldn't be delayed. He didn't speak, just looked out of the window and responded, "Okay." When Feng Ling came to a fork in the road ahead, she turned the car to the northeast and stepped on the accelerator all the way. The cars chasing after them were also very good and fast. No matter how fast they were, they couldn't get rid of them. Now, they could only see if they could get rid of them in the jungle and if they could counterattack. Looking into the distance, even though she couldn't see the jungle here, Feng Ling's eyes seemed to be shining as she looked straight ahead. After about 20 minutes, Feng Ling continued to observe the cars behind. Suddenly she turned to look at Li Nanheng, who had been silent for a long time, and suddenly looked down at the co-pilot's seat under him, only to see that the light brown leather seat had been dyed red by the blood flowing out of his back, and a lot of blood had flowed down the seat. Feng Ling frowned and suddenly turned the car around, causing the car to shake violently. Li Nanheng, who had almost fallen into a coma, suddenly opened his eyes because of such a change. Even though his eyes were filled with endless exhaustion and haggard from excessive blood loss, he was still very vigilant at the moment he opened his eyes. When he looked out of the window at this moment, someone suddenly leaned out of the window and raised a gun to shoot at their car. The glass of this Hummer was bulletproof, which was very effective against this kind of bullet. Because they knew this, every bullet was aimed in the direction of the tire. Knowing their plan, Feng Ling kept changing the direction of the car, avoided every bullet and said, "Boss, don't sleep." Li Nanheng's face was pale. He just looked at the situation in the rearview mirror, breathed silently, and then slowly raised his hand, put a cold hand on Feng Ling's leg, took out the gun in her pocket and said hoarsely, "Keep driving." Feng Ling looked at him, only to see that Li Nanheng seemed to have gathered some strength from somewhere. He held the gun in his hand and opened the window on the other side. Facing the strong wind outside the car, he raised the gun and shot backward. Feng Ling knew how accurate Li Nanheng's marksmanship was. Even if the speed of the car was fast and the wind was strong, even if they were forced to walk in front, even if he was seriously injured, as long as he fired a shot, he would definitely hit their tires. But he couldn't use his arms and wrists at all. She couldn't care too much now. She drove forward crazily, and at the same time she heard the sound of Li Nanheng shooting. She immediately raised her eyes and looked at the rearview mirror. She couldn't see the direction of the bullet, but in less than 2 seconds she suddenly saw that the car chasing in front suddenly tilted down and had a perfect tire burst. The corners of Feng Ling's mouth lifted. As expected of Li Nanheng. Then another shot and the tires of another car were burst at the same time. After several consecutive shots, after the tires of those cars were burst, Li Nanheng pulled the trigger again, and then suddenly retracted his body out of the window. Feng Ling quickly pressed the central lock and helped him close the window. Li Nanheng didn't have much strength. He leaned against the seat and threw the gun back into her arms. "There are no bullets. Let's act according to the situation in the jungle." Although those cars had burst tires, they could still continue to chase, but their speed would be affected by the impact of the tires. Feng Ling took this opportunity to rush in the direction where she could vaguely see a dark green. Seeing that the car behind had been far away, Feng Ling finally had the mood to ask, "Just now before I got on the car, I saw a little injury on the car door yesterday. You didn't have time to send it back to Los Angeles to be repaired. Yesterday when you were driving at such a high speed, you directly parked the car in the middle of the road. Weren't you afraid of being the first to die?" Li Nanheng sat there with little energy because of the injury on his back. His back was already covered with blood. He closed his eyes and smiled. "What have I been afraid of?" Such a rhetorical question caused the man's former arrogance to surface once again. Feng Ling didn't reply, but the man continued on his own. "Perhaps what I'm really afraid of is when I rushed back to the base 2 years ago and saw your empty room and the wine bottles on the ground. Perhaps what I'm really afraid of is that day when you were drugged and taken away in that car. If I didn't think of a way to stop you, who knows what they would have done to you. What really scared me was that when I was chased and surrounded by these people, you would be implicated because of me." Li Nanheng said as he closed his eyes and frowned slightly. "So, Feng Ling, whether you hate me or not, since you've already left 11 base, you should learn to cherish your life. Your life is no longer sold to the military or the police. You don't need to be responsible for anyone. You are only yourself. Feng Ling did not answer. At this moment she suddenly looked up at the window. Li Nanheng also seemed to have heard something. He opened his eyes, slowly raised his pale face and looked in that direction. But from the color and model, it was clearly not 11 Base's helicopter. Is it an enemy or a friend? Feng Ling asked. Li Nanheng didn't hesitate. Enemy? Hearing this word, Feng Ling retracted her gaze and stared at the jungle ahead. As far as I know, there are many pits of different sizes in the jungles near the city. They are all hidden under the grass and the car will be destroyed if it is driven into them. I will directly crash the car into the nearest tree stump. Before we hit it, we must jump out of the car. Otherwise, no matter how good the performance of your car is, at this speed, the two of us will also die. Li Nanheng didn't speak, but as soon as she finished speaking, he directly unfastened his seat belt. His pale face was expressionless as he looked in the direction of the jungle, saying indifferently, "In a place like the jungle, you are the boss. I will listen to you." It wasn't like he didn't have field camp and jungle training. Did he need to coax her all the time? Feng Ling immediately squinted at him, but the car was about to hit her. She quickly let go of the steering wheel and unfastened her seat belt. A second before the car crashed forward, the doors on both sides were suddenly pushed open, and the two quickly jumped out. Please remember the domain name of this book. For mobile version website, M. Chapter 1047. The tall black car suddenly sped into the jungle at a speed of more than 250 miles per hour, fiercely crashing into the adjacent boulders and trees at the edge of the jungle. In an instant, a loud noise and an almost explosive sound erupted. After Feng Ling jumped out of the car, she felt pain in her limbs even though she was not injured. She quickly climbed up, looked back at the car that had begun to emit smoke, staggered around the car and walked to the other side. Seeing that Li Nanheng had also stood up, she hurriedly walked over and held his arm. "I'm fine, you don't need to help me," Li Nanheng said hoarsely. He was about to pull his hand out of hers when Feng Ling held his arm firmly. At the same time she glanced into the depths of the jungle. There are cars behind them and helicopters in front. Let's go in first. Li Nanheng closed his eyes. It was clear that the injuries on his body and the violent impact when he jumped out of the car had a great impact on him. He did not say anything but only nodded. He was still about to withdraw his hand from her hand, but Feng Ling could see that he was seriously injured and held his arm tightly. "Don't move. Let's go in first." Li Nanheng glanced at her. Before he could speak, he was supported by Feng Ling into the bushes that stretched as far as the eye could see. Inside there were indeed man-made pits under the bushes. The pits were already covered with tall bushes of different heights, so it was not easy to find the location of the giant pit, and there was no way to avoid it. It was very easy to fall into the pit if one was not careful. Both of them had received professional wilderness survival training, and 11 Base had organized many survival training in the tropical rainforest. Men had a natural desire to conquer the wild and the jungle, and their sense of direction was also naturally keen. Feng Ling had lived in the jungle since she was a child, so this kind of dangerous place for many people was as easy as walking on flat ground for the two of them. It would be better if Li Nanheng wasn't injured because of her. Unfortunately, his injuries were not light. He even bled all the way. The man relied on his own strength to walk for about a few hundred meters. With Feng Ling's support, he gradually fell to her side uncontrollably. Feng Ling supported him with force. "Hold on. Let's find a place where they won't easily find us. The helicopter will keep patrolling above. At least before our people arrive, we can't be blocked by them. Right now, the two of us don't have any advantage at all. We have to find a safe place first." Li Nanheng closed his eyes and nodded. He didn't want to lean on her, but Feng Ling held his waist tightly and held him with all her strength. "Let's go." With pale lips, Li Nanheng lowered his eyes to look at the little woman who was trying her best to help him walk in. He slowly raised his arm that had been hanging by his side and finally allowed himself to put his hand on her shoulder, allowing her to support him all the way in. Right now, they didn't know how many people had come to surround them. They had come prepared. No matter how powerful the two of them were facing such a pincer attack, and Li Nanheng was already injured, it was impossible for them to act rashly. Feng Ling supported him under various hidden bushes. After walking for another few hundred meters, the man's body suddenly fell down. Feng Ling turned her eyes abruptly, only to see that Li Nanheng's face was unbelievably pale, but the man didn't say anything. She quickly supported Li Nanheng to lean against a tree by the side and then retracted her hand from his waist. She lowered her head to see that her sleeves and palms had been dyed red by the blood on his back. He had been bleeding for so long. If a doctor came in time to help stop the bleeding and remove the bullet, it would be better, but in this situation how could she find a doctor? Can you still hold on? Feng Ling looked at him worriedly and lowered her head to check the wound on his back. She was about to pull his clothes off, but as soon as her hand touched his collar, the man pressed it down. I'm fine, Li Nanheng said indifferently. It's just a small injury. You said it's a small injury when you were hit with a steel rod. Now that the bullet is in your flesh, you still say it's a small injury? Feng Ling waved his hand away and tugged his collar open. She lowered her head to see the bullet wound on his shoulder. It was a red mark about 3 centimeters in size, but this place was already badly mutilated, and his back was covered with blood. Li Nanheng originally wanted to push her away, but this woman was so strong that he couldn't even push her hand away. He was pressed down and his clothes were pulled open. Feeling the woman's gaze on his back, Li Nanheng couldn't push her away, so he could only look at the ground and sigh with a smile. What are you laughing at? Feng Ling closed his clothes and turned to look at the top of the jungle. The leaves here were dense and could block the helicopter's patrol. Those who drove over wouldn't find this place so quickly. She retracted her gaze and looked at the man. Is it funny to be injured like this? Li Nanheng smiled and said hoarsely, I'm in a good mood. Can't I laugh? Feng Ling put on a straight face. Are you crazy? You're still happy when you're injured like this? Li Nanheng still smiled and then looked around. Let's go. Let's continue. I'm a man. I'm not so delicate. I can still hold on. You're a man, not an immortal. The bullet is in your flesh. Do you think you're made of iron? Feng Ling complained coldly as she helped him up again. As she walked in, she paid attention to the man's expression from time to time. She had already tried her best to hold him and let him lean his weight on her, but the man clearly wanted to save face. Even in this state, he still insisted on walking on his own. At most, after walking dozens of steps, he couldn't take it anymore and leaned on her to rest for a few seconds before continuing forward. Feng Ling couldn't take it anymore. She suddenly pulled him and walked toward him, turning her back to him. I'll carry you. Although Li Nanheng's face was pale, he raised his brows because of her words and looked at the girl's slender back. Li Nanheng, you know that you've already implicated me. If you don't want me to waste time here with you and be dragged to death, hurry up and come up. I'll carry you. I can run for thousands of meters with a weight of 300 kilograms. You're not even half of it. I can still carry you. Come up. Li Nanheng curved his lips and leaned over to press against her back. However, he did not place his weight on her. Instead, he reached out and hugged her from behind, pulling her into his embrace. Chapter 1048. Feng Ling furrowed her brows and said sternly, I told you to come up. There's no need to carry me. Let me hold you. I can recover a lot of strength. The man spoke softly and huskily behind her back. Then, just as Feng Ling was about to fly into a rage, he took a step back and let her go. Feng Ling turned her head abruptly and looked at him in confusion. What time is it? You still? No matter when, I will always be your man. There is no reason for you to carry me on your back, unless I die and can't even breathe or control my own actions and thoughts. Otherwise, I will always be the one to protect you, and you will never be the one to carry me on your back. As the man spoke, he walked past her with a pale face and walked straight ahead. Even though he was gradually losing strength due to excessive blood loss, even though his steps were slow and he staggered, he still walked. Feng Ling looked at the man's black clothes. There was almost no blood stain, but the smell of blood in the air made her frown. She quickly walked up and raised her hand to support him. Then I'll support you, okay? The man's cold expression did not change. He turned to look at her. Feng Ling's expression was usually colder than his, but because of the wound on his back, she could not help it. Afraid that something would really happen to him, she carefully held his arm with both hands. Usually, there will be some places for wild animals to hide in the depths of the jungle. They are all very hidden small caves or tree holes under certain bushes. There are many of them. They may not be able to find us even if they want to. After saying that, she dragged the man to look around. Finally, she found a hidden place under an old tree that could accommodate 2 people. She hurriedly helped him to sit down. It was a hole under a big tree that should be impossible for the group of people to find. When Li Nanheng sat down, he frowned slightly because of the wound on his back, but it was only for a moment. He turned to look at the tall bushes outside. There are traces of blood all the way out. If they want to find us, they can borrow 2 hounds to find us. Don't worry, I'll handle it. Wait a moment. As Feng Ling spoke, she walked out of the small space that could only accommodate the 2 of them and went into the tall bushes outside. Although this jungle was very large and looked dark and mysterious, it was actually the jungle closest to the city. The animals here had long run away because of the excessive disturbance of human beings. Only snakes and some harmless small animals could be found here. She plucked some chameleon grass from the jungle and crushed it into mud. Then, she rubbed the smelly chameleon grass mud all over the place along the path she came from. Then, she went to the other side and continued to rub the mud. In this way, after more than 10 minutes, Feng Ling quickly cleaned most of the areas. The smell of the grass was very strong. Not to mention that it was impossible for them to have a hound. Even if there was a hound, it was impossible for them to distinguish which was heavier because the smell of the grass was mixed with the smell of blood, which could be easily confused with the smell of human. Only Feng Ling, who grew up in the jungle, could understand this. For others, unless they were professional jungle explorers, even authoritative doctors might not know this kind of thing. When she went back into the tree hole, she saw Li Nanheng sitting there, eyes closed, motionless. Feng Ling's heart skipped a beat. She quickly walked over and squatted down in front of him. Li Nanheng? The man with his eyes closed opened his eyes because she suddenly pinched his shoulder hard. He looked at the girl in front of him. Although his face was pale and weak, his eyes seemed to still be bright. Didn't you just call me Boss Li? But it's good. Anything sounds better than Mr. Li? Feng Ling glared at him and didn't want to talk nonsense with him. She took out the dagger she had brought with her before getting into the car and cut open his clothes. When the man raised his brows and leaned against her, she said coldly, "I've already seen your wounds yesterday. I don't think you mind if I take another look today." "I don't mind, but your action of cutting open my clothes is too rough." The man chuckled hoarsely. Feng Ling said coldly, "If you like gentle people, go find gentle people. Don't bother me." For some reason, Li Nanheng smiled because of her words and even laughed out loud. At the same time, he couldn't help coughing because of the wound on his body, and the wound on his back that hadn't dried up continued to bleed. Just now, because he hadn't stopped moving, the wound couldn't heal easily. Until now, he hadn't passed out because of his good physique. Feng Ling looked at the man's pale but still smiling face and suddenly remembered that night on Rogers Pass. At that time, he was so weak that she didn't want to get out of bed for several days. She hid in the tent next door and didn't want to go out to see anyone. She was really blessed by this man's physical strength, so her physical strength was really nothing compared to his. For some reason, she suddenly thought of that matter. Feng Ling's expression darkened again, but she did not speak. She bent down and turned the man's shoulder. Then she leaned behind him and checked his wound. She then asked, "Did the bullet penetrate your shoulder blade?" "I don't think so. If the bone was pierced, I wouldn't have walked so far," the man replied hoarsely. "It's only in the flesh. Don't you have a knife? Help me take the bullet out." Feng Ling thought she had heard wrong. Her hand that was still around his wound suddenly paused and she looked up with a jerk. "What did you say?" Li Nanheng looked back at her and picked up the dagger she had just thrown on the ground. "Take the bullet out." Feng Ling's hand left his back. "I don't know how to. We still don't know when we can leave. You should know very well that the longer the bullet stays in the body, the more dangerous it is. Do you want me to be dragged to death here?" The man asked calmly. "Can't you cut the flesh near the wound? The bullet is only in the surface of the flesh. It's not so difficult. You can take it out directly." "I've never done it. I don't know how to do it," Feng Ling said as she looked at the wound on his shoulder thoughtfully. She remembered that when she was bitten by a snake, he made a cross-shaped scar on her shoulder with a knife. It seemed that if she drew a cross, she could indeed get the bullet out. Chapter 1049. Li Nanheng didn't look at the uncertain expression on her face and threw the dagger into her arms. "Come." Feng Jie picked up the dagger and looked at the wound on his back. Then, she saw that the man had lowered his head slightly, completely exposing his smooth and perfect back to her. Her fingers that were holding the dagger froze. Feng Jie picked up the dagger and looked at the wound on his back. She held the dagger above the wound on his shoulder for a while and stared at the bullet wound. She steeled her heart, pressed his shoulder with one hand, and pressed the sharp knife against the wound with the other. "Then bear with it. I'm not very good at it. If it really hurts you..." The man didn't say anything, which was a silent reassurance to her. When she cut down with the tip of the knife, she could clearly feel that although the man did not make a sound, because her knife had not been sterilized and she had never treated anyone with it before, she might have poked a nerve behind his shoulder. She could feel the man's back muscles tensing as the tip of the knife went deeper and deeper into his body. She turned her head to look at him. She couldn't see the man's expression, but she could feel that the cross knife she made was definitely not as professional as the one he made on her shoulder. At that time she did feel pain, but she was particularly relieved. How could Li Nanheng leave this matter to her? She had just cut open a cross blade when the tip of the blade seemed to touch the bullet embedded in her flesh. She suddenly said, "I found the bullet." Yes. The tensed muscles on the man's back seemed to have gotten used to the pain and gradually relaxed. His back was still facing her, and his voice was calm as if he wasn't the one enduring the pain. "Do as you see fit." The bullet was not very deep. Feng Ling looked at the bloodstain on the cross knife that was still bleeding, tested it with the tip of the knife, and then accurately picked out the bullet. The blood-stained bullet fell to the ground in an instant, emitting the crisp sound of metal hitting the ground. In just a few minutes, Feng Ling's forehead was covered in sweat. After confirming that the bullet had been taken out, she looked at the wound on his back, feeling distressed and helpless, and only said in a low voice, "It's done." The man in front of her did not move or speak. Feng Ling glanced at the wound on his back again and then tentatively leaned forward to look at her, only to see that the man seemed to be focused on something. She was distracted by the matter of taking out the bullet and abruptly withdrew her attention because of his silent and cold gaze. Then she vaguely heard at least 2 helicopters hovering above the jungle. From this distance, it could be heard that they were desperately searching for them. However, because the jungle was too dense, if they walked in normally, the chances of finding them would be higher. If they wanted to come in by car or helicopter, it would be equivalent to entering a blind spot. There was no room for them to do anything. Of course, even if someone really came in on foot at this time without the sniper rifle in the distance and their hidden ambush, not to mention Feng Ling, even the seriously injured Li Nanheng could easily knock down 2 of them. Feng Ling bent down to pick up the blood-stained bullet on the ground, held it in her hand for a few seconds and said, "It's a small silencer AK. Who is that woman? This gun is not cheap." No background. It's just that she has a lot of men and none of them are short of money. It's not difficult for her to get a top-quality gun. As Li Nanheng spoke, he raised his arm and was about to put on the clothes on his back, but Feng Ling reached out and pressed his hand. "Don't move. Although the bullet has been taken out, we still have to deal with the wound. If you put on the clothes again, do you want the clothes to stick to the wound after the blood dries?" As she spoke, she took out a small bag of wet wipes from her pocket, which she occasionally brought. There was only half a small bag left, but fortunately it could wipe the blood. She didn't have a chance to disinfect the knife just now. After all, this place was not like the stone platform on the mountain wall of the Snake Valley. Now she started a fire to disinfect here, which was to inform the people outside of the hiding place. Everything was in a hurry, and now she didn't care whether the wet wipes had been disinfected or not, but she tried not to wipe his wound and the knife, only wiped the blood near the wound, and then wiped the blood on other parts of his back. Finally, she lifted up his torn clothes and simply put it on his back. "Put on the clothes first. I cut a little on the shoulder so the blood shouldn't stick to the flesh." As she spoke, she cleaned up the blood on other parts of his body. When she was about to help the man lean against the side and pick up another clean wet wipe to wipe his face, she found that the man suddenly became very quiet. Seeing that the man's eyes had been closed, her hands on his arms and shoulders stiffened, and she leaned over to him. "Li Nanheng, don't be so quiet. Open your eyes and talk." Li Nanheng didn't respond. Feng Ling was a little anxious. When she took out the bullet just now, she knew that he had really lost a lot of blood, and his physical strength had long been unable to support. "Li Nanheng, just now was the first time I took out a bullet. Every first time in my life is related to you. If you dare to die, I will leave your body in the wilderness and throw you deeper into the jungle to feed those birds and beasts." Li Nanheng suddenly let out a low, hoarse laugh, and at the same time he coughed because of the laughter and then said hoarsely, "I just closed my eyes for a while and didn't speak. I'm conserving my strength. I promise I won't die." Hearing his answer, Feng Ling suddenly realized that she suddenly panicked. She abruptly withdrew her hand from his shoulder, turned to sit next to him and said, "Don't block bullets for me again. If you do it again, I will never see you again in this life." Li Nanheng didn't know if it was because he was conserving his strength or because he didn't have the strength to speak, but he didn't speak. As time passed, Feng Ling calculated the time it would take for the nearest rescue team to arrive. After a while, she felt that Li Nanheng's breath seemed to be unusually quiet. She turned her eyes and saw that Li Nanheng's eyes were still closed. Because the bullet had just been taken out, the wound on his shoulder was new and old. Blood was still flowing out, and the ground had been stained with blood. If this continued, he would lose too much blood. Even if he wouldn't die from the bullet, he would still bleed to death. Feng Ling's eyelids twitched, and she abruptly raised her hand to slap his face. Li Nanheng. Today I received a notice that there will be a burst of chapters. I may have to start saving chapters again. As for the specific time, I'll tell you after I save the chapters. Please bookmark this site to read the latest. Bookmark easy to read. Please remember the original domain name of this book. For mobile version website, M. Chapter 1050. After patting him a few times, he didn't seem to respond. Feng Ling approached him, looked at his face, and called his name as she patted him. The man's quietly closed eyes moved slightly, and his fingers on his lap also moved slightly as though he was giving her a response. Feng Ling saw the movement of his hands and then saw him slowly open his eyes. Suddenly, she didn't know why her heart suddenly ached. She looked at his face and whispered, "What do you need to do to hold on? Don't fall asleep?" The man opened his eyes slightly to look at her. It seemed that he was unable to smile, but he still moved the corners of his lips slightly and said in a very hoarse and soft voice, "What do you think?" Feng Ling didn't understand what he meant and only looked at him. "What do I think?" He really didn't understand when he should understand, and he didn't understand when he shouldn't understand. Li Nanheng sighed with a smile, slowly raised his hand and pointed at his own face. "Kiss me." His face was pale, his voice was weak and his eyes were haggard, but the 3 words he said were still extremely seductive. Feng Ling's heart couldn't help beating hard. She looked at him coldly, stood up and took a step back. "Then you'd better sleep." Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and said hoarsely, "You'd rather watch me die than have anything to do with me? Then go to hell." Feng Ling's eyes were full of impatience. Li Nanheng looked at her, curved his lips and didn't say anything more. He slowly closed his eyes again. At first, Feng Ling thought he was doing it on purpose, but the man's face was unbelievably pale. Although she couldn't see any emotion between his brows, she could feel that he didn't have much strength right now. Seeing that his eyes hadn't opened for a while, she suddenly leaned down again. "Li Nanheng, don't sleep." However, the man's eyes were still quietly closed, and he leaned against the tree hole motionlessly as though there was no reaction. Feng Ling frowned, wondering if she was really too cruel at this time. After all, he was injured because of her. She raised her hand and patted the man's shoulder twice. "Wake up. Li Nanheng, don't sleep, wake up." Before she could finish speaking, the man with his eyes closed raised his arms and hugged her. Although he was not strong, Feng Ling's squatting posture was not very stable. She was caught off guard and fell into his arms. When Feng Ling abruptly raised her eyes, the man leaned toward her face. He closed his eyes and held her. His pale face was filled with enjoyment as he said, "Just a kiss." Feng Ling pursed her lips and glared at him. Under the man's blissful expression, she pushed him away. "I don't think you'll die either." As she spoke, she got up and walked out of the tree hole. "The sound of the helicopter has disappeared. I don't know where it stopped. I'll go out and take a look." Looking at the little woman who rushed out angrily, Li Nanheng sat there, his pale lips slightly twitched and he chuckled, "Don't go too far. Be careful. I won't get lost in the jungle." Feng Ling retorted as she walked out. She was about to continue speaking when she suddenly realized that she had spoken too much. She immediately shut her mouth and looked in the direction where she had heard the sound. Feng Ling looked around outside. Whether it was on the trees, in the grass, in the sky, on the ground, or in any position that would leave traces, she confirmed that the group of people had not found this place, and this was already deep in the jungle. Those who had never lived in the jungle must have either fallen into a pit or walked in another direction. In this vast jungle, surrounded by dense tall grass, it was likely that they did not know how difficult it was to find the place where she was hiding. After confirming that it was safe, Feng Ling picked a few pieces of grass on the way back. She was not sure if they had anti-inflammatory and hemostatic effects. She remembered that this kind of thing could be used, but she did not know whether it was used to stop bleeding or reduce inflammation. In short, it definitely wouldn't have any worse effect. Walking back into the tree hole, she saw that the man's eyes were still closed. However, when he heard her footsteps coming in, although the man struggled to open his eyes, he looked in her direction and smiled lightly. As expected, "You can't get lost, Feng Ling." Feng Ling pretended not to hear him. She walked over and took off the clothes he was wearing behind him. Then she placed the grass she had just picked on a small stone by the side, used 2 stones to grind out the green juice, and then applied it to the wound on his back. Li Nanheng was instantly energized by the sudden tingling sensation. He turned his head to look at the little woman who was helping him apply medicine. "What is this?" "I don't know. Maybe it's poison. Something that will make your wound fester until your whole body begins to fester," Feng Ling answered impatiently. Hearing this, Li Nanheng was very calm. "Is that so? It's not bad to die in your hands." Feng Ling really did not want to talk to him. When she helped him apply the green juice on the wound, she increased the strength of her hands. Only when she heard the man finally could not help but groan in pain did she slightly ease her strength. In the end, she helped him put on his clothes again, supported him to lean against the wall, and looked down at the time on her phone. "Are you sure you don't want to call the police? Just wait for the people from 11 Base to arrive? Based on your understanding of the police, most of their forces work for the people. To deal with this kind of encirclement and attack, their people are just cannon fodder. Why do they have to implicate so many people and bring up the storm of 11 Base? Is there anything that our own people in 11 Base can't handle? Do we need outsiders to help us?" Li Nanheng asked mildly. That was true. Only the military and the police had asked 11 Base for help time and time again. 11 Base had never needed their help when they encountered something. After all, there was a huge gap in strength. However, Li Nanheng's words were really arrogant. He didn't put the American police in his eyes at all. Seeing that his eyelids were about to close, Feng Ling reached out to hold his hand. She pressed her fingers hard between his thumb and index finger and deliberately increased the strength of her hand. This kind of pain could at least ensure that his mind was always awake and active. In this situation, if he really fell asleep, it would only become worse. "Do you feel that you can move your injured shoulder?" "At that time, I didn't control the strength of the knife well. I was afraid that it would hurt your shoulder blade." Feng Ling held her hand and placed it on his lap. He looked at her mildly and did not speak. He did not have the strength, so he just looked at her like this. Chapter 1051. Feng Ling found that he seemed to have a feeling that he couldn't take another look at her. In an instant, anger surged in her heart, and she dug her fingers into his palm, grabbing and scratching him hard, making him feel pain. When he looked at her in confusion because of her inexplicable anger, she glared at him and said, "Li Nanheng, from now on, until the people of 11 Base come, I don't want to hear any last words about you. If you want me to live well, you'd better stay awake for me. Otherwise, I don't mind leading those people over and we'll die together." Li Nanheng looked at her with a slight frown and did not answer. "Did you hear that?" Feng Ling looked at him coldly. The man smiled lightly. And just a few minutes after Feng Ling sat down next to him, she heard the sound of the helicopter approaching again, and this time it seemed to be accompanied by some sound from afar. She turned to look at Li Nanheng, who was not in a good state of mind, but obviously, he also heard the sound and looked out of the tree hole indifferently. They are a group of people who often wander on the edge of darkness. In order to hide, they must have hidden in places like the jungle before so they can more or less avoid some dangers. It may take some effort to find this place, but after so long they are not useless after all. They do have some ability to find this place. Feng Ling quietly put the dagger on her waist, glanced outside and said indifferently, "You wait here." At this time, Li Nanheng wanted Feng Ling not to take risks, but now was not the time to say this. If one of them didn't go, two of them would also die here. Looking at Feng Ling's movement, Li Nanheng said in a low voice, "Protect yourself. After all, in the jungle you have a better chance of winning. Watch the opportunity and escape as soon as possible." "You are here. I won't escape." The slender, tall, short-haired woman said this when she walked out of the tree hole and resolutely walked out. Looking at Feng Ling's back, Li Nanheng closed his eyes, sighed, and picked up his cell phone with some difficulty. The tracking signal of 11 Base had almost flown to the vicinity of Boston. As long as the target position did not change, within 40 minutes, 11 Base's rescue plane would definitely arrive. 40 minutes. If it was someone else, they might not have been able to withstand it. But Feng Ling could. In the jungle, there were layers of green everywhere. Feng Ling quickly shuttled through the tall grass, occasionally hearing the movements of snakes, insects, and ants passing through the nearby grass. Her ears were sharp as she listened to the sounds of those people approaching in this direction. Just when she felt that those people had searched all the way here and were only 300 to 400 meters away, Feng Ling lowered her head to look at a deep pit covered by tall grass not far from her feet. She then glanced at the several thick old trees by the side and quickly jumped up the tree. She leaned over the dense tree trunks and looked down. From this angle she could see that there were about a dozen people coming in. Each of them held a different type of gun in their hands. At such a distance she could recognize the models of the guns in their hands. She could also tell which guns were powerful and which ones looked heavy but were actually not very powerful. She could easily avoid them. After observing the situation clearly, Feng Ling picked up the stone she had just prepared and quickly threw one to the side 100 meters away. The sound of the stone hitting the tree trunk was not loud, but from the position of the group of people, they felt it was a strange sound and were immediately distracted by the sound. They all carefully turned to the side and pointed their muzzles in that direction. Seeing that their attention had turned to her, Feng Ling observed the trees behind them and took the opportunity to quickly jump down. She bent over in the grass and sprinted forward. She then leaped forward and kicked a man holding a small handgun behind them. The moment she kicked the man, she snatched the gun from his hand within a second. At the same time, when the others suddenly turned their heads, she stepped on the head of the man on the ground who had yet to react, and with a flash she jumped onto the nearest tree behind them. Then those people finally realized what had happened. In an instant, gunshots rang out from all directions, all aimed at Feng Ling's direction. Feng Ling used the thick trunk to block the bullets, and the dense leaves on the tree made it impossible for them to find her exact location. Taking advantage of the fact that they were shooting randomly, she jumped to another tree in front of her, but all the directions were in the opposite direction of the tree hole where Li Nanheng was. She dodged the bullets and successfully led the people to another direction and into the grass. More than a dozen people saw her figure, and for a moment, they all chased after Feng Ling. However, after running more than a dozen steps, there was suddenly a few screams. The people who went around to the front looked back with a jerk, only to see that 3 or 4 of their companions had fallen into a pit under the grass. "Damn it! She's playing with us." The people standing in front roared angrily and fired wildly at every tree around them. However, gunshots rang out from all directions in the jungle. Feng Ling had taken the opportunity to jump back from the next tree, stood on the nearest tree less than a meter behind them and looked down at them. A group of fools was still shooting at other trees, but they didn't hear the movements in the tree behind them. Feng Ling squatted on it, picked up the gun she had just snatched, pointed it at the back of the leader's head and pulled the trigger. When the people under the tree heard the sound of the trigger, they subconsciously turned back, including those who had been pointed at by Feng Ling. The moment they turned back, they seemed to have sensed something. However, his reaction was still a step too late. There was a bang in the air, and this sudden bullet pierced the head of the person who had rushed at the front. He suddenly stood there stiffly, his eyes empty as if he couldn't believe, unwilling and full of fear, and then he fell heavily to the ground. Seeing this scene, those people were all shocked, and in an instant they all raised their guns to this tree. Feng Ling's shot was indeed very risky, but at this time if she didn't kill the leader, the order of this group of people would not be disrupted. She dodged the bullets they fired in time and looked back at the other nearby tree trunks. Now these people were all surrounding her. If she jumped out, she would immediately be shot full of holes by their bullets. Chapter 1052. Feng Ling weighed the gun in her hand and estimated that there were still 6 or 7 bullets left in the gun. She looked at the people under the tree and suddenly fixed her eyes on the man between the trees in front of her. She took out 2 stones from her pocket and threw them in the opposite direction. Because the speed at which the stones were thrown was too fast, no one knew what they were, but they suddenly heard a female voice from the tree, "Be careful of explosives." When they heard these words, they couldn't immediately tell whether it was real or not. In an instant, they raised their guns and quickly retreated. Feng Ling took advantage of the opportunity when they glanced in the direction of the explosives, to raise her gun and shoot the 2 men in the head. She then took the opportunity after the 2 men fell to quickly escape to the opposite tree. Taking advantage of the fact that their encirclement was forced open, she quickly continued to run to other trees. However, at this moment, several of them had already noticed her cunning in advance and chased after her. When Feng Ling was about to use the same trick again, they fired first and successfully intercepted her. Feng Ling suddenly lost her footing and fell to the ground halfway. She glanced at the wound on her arm caused by the bullet and the red mark on the skin of her arm. Noticing that those people were approaching, her eyes darkened and she turned to escape. However, without the protection of the tree, it was difficult for her to be surrounded by more than a dozen people and the guns in their hands. A good tiger can't defeat a pack of wolves. She couldn't jump up the tree above, so she could only rely on the grass below. But after all, there was not much advantage on the ground. During the 2 minutes of being chased, she had almost no room to fight back. She could only roll around to avoid being hit by the bullets. A group of people chased her relentlessly. They all had spare magazines and didn't lack bullets at all, which was even more disadvantageous for her. In the blink of an eye, 2 people fell into the pit that Feng Ling had just deliberately avoided. When 2 people fell, the guns in their hands fell into the grass and Feng Ling was suddenly shot in the arm. She endured the pain and leaned over the grass to escape to the other side, only to find that no matter how she escaped, she seemed to be trapped in this encirclement. The point was that she had gone in the opposite direction of the tree hole where Li Nanheng hid. This group of people seemed to notice something and now forced her to escape in the opposite direction. As a result, when she looked up, she could see the tall tree not far away. Without guessing, she knew that Li Nanheng was still there. She couldn't go over. She couldn't let these people find him. Feng Ling couldn't care less about the people holding guns behind her. She suddenly turned around and ran to the other side. There was no pit here and there was only a mountain wall ahead. It was a dead end, but for Li Nanheng it was a way to live. She rushed over, and just as she was about to be surrounded, there were still bullets fired in her direction. She was almost shot in the shoulder. Fortunately, she dodged to the side, and the bullet only grazed the skin of her shoulder, but she still felt a burning pain. Suddenly, she seemed to notice the movement of the helicopter above. Although this jungle was dense and deep in the jungle, she found that her and Li Nanheng's cell phone signals were still there, which meant that these people's cell phone signals were also there. No matter where they chased and where they needed support, they could find the people driving the helicopter at any time. At the moment when Feng Ling suddenly realized this, a loud noise suddenly broke out in the sky. Then she raised her head and felt as if something had fallen down. A flash of fire passed through the dense jungle and landed at her feet, causing a huge shock. Feng Ling's eyes trembled, but it was too late. She had been thrown up by the bomb that was suddenly launched by the helicopter. Her whole body was in pain, and she felt as if her internal organs were about to break. She was suddenly blown up and finally fell to the ground 10 meters away. In an instant, she felt as if there was blood in her throat, and she suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. The bomb just now was only a meter away from falling directly on her head. That was the pain of being smashed into pieces, but at such a close distance, even if her body was not smashed into pieces, the force of the explosion was enough to instantly cause internal injuries to Feng Ling. She struggled to get up from the ground, but the smell of burning was everywhere. The bomb had caused a fire everywhere. She coughed and spat out another mouthful of blood, but she could not get up no matter how hard she tried. In a blink of an eye, she saw that among the group of people who had also been affected by the bomb, one person had already raised a gun to her head. In the midst of the fire, it was clear that he was going to kill her before leaving. Feng Ling frowned and dug her fingers into the ground. There seemed to be some sounds approaching. She wasn't sure whether it was the enemy or the people from 11 base. She didn't have the energy to distinguish the movements. She just stared at the muzzle of the man's gun. She wanted to avoid it, but she couldn't even move. Someone's coming. We've been surrounded. Suddenly, a few people behind that person shouted. Following that, a group of people hastily scattered in all directions. The man who raised the gun to Feng Ling was about to shoot her and then leave, but at the moment he pulled the trigger, he suddenly heard a gunshot. Then, Feng Ling saw the man who pointed the gun at her suddenly fell straight down. When he fell, she raised her eyes and saw Li Nanheng standing not far away with a pale face. The gun in his hand was the one that the 2 people who had fallen into the pit had dropped on the ground. He actually came out from inside. He was injured like this, but he could still walk out. Feng Ling looked at him in disbelief. Just as she struggled to get up from the fire on the ground, she suddenly saw people rushing out from all directions. When she saw that those people were all wearing the uniforms of 11 base, her heart finally relaxed a little, and she instantly let herself lie on the ground powerlessly. The feeling of being blown up in her chest was so painful that she felt as if blood was about to gush out, but when the blood reached her throat, she swallowed it hard. Boss. Han Jin and Xiao Su hadn't seen clearly the man lying in the fire not far away, but when they saw the wound on Li Nanheng's body, they hurried over to support him. Then Kay, who came forward with a sniper rifle, looked in that direction. He didn't expect to meet the person he hadn't seen for 2 years here. When he saw it clearly, he suddenly let out an incredulous voice. Feng Ling. Chapter 1053. Kay's cry of surprise attracted everyone's attention to the man lying on the ground. Feng Ling slowly raised her head from the ground and looked at them with her pale, blood-stained face. They hadn't seen each other for 2 years, and now that they were reunited, she didn't know how she felt at this moment. She only remembered the scene when she left, and her hands dug deeper into the ground. Seeing that she seemed to be seriously injured, Kay hurriedly handed the sniper rifle in his hand to his brother behind him, rushed up, bent down, and hurriedly helped her up from the ground. Seeing the blood on her mouth and her staggering appearance, he frowned. "You," Feng Ling gasped and said hoarsely, "just now the bomb above landed by my feet." Kay immediately held her steady in disbelief, and his voice suddenly became serious. "Then hurry to the hospital. Quick." Feng Ling didn't have more strength to speak. When two familiar 11 base brothers came up to help support her from behind, she heard the conversation between Han Jin and Xiao Su. "Boss, why didn't you tell us that you found Feng Ling?" Li Nanheng didn't answer. He was also supported by them. At this moment, both of them were seriously injured. There were many things that should and should not be said. It was as if they could only understand each other in their hearts. Li Nanheng just looked at Feng Ling and said indifferently, "Get on the helicopter and go back to the base. Is Dr. Wen coming with us? Call her over and let me take a look at her first." Han Jin and Xiao Su looked at the wound on Li Nanheng's back. They wanted to say that his injury was not light, but after all, Boss said so, and even though it had been 2 years, they all knew that Boss Li had been looking for Feng Ling crazily in the past 2 years. Now if they didn't let Dr. Wen take a look at Feng Ling first, Boss probably wouldn't let the doctor touch him. "Alright, let's go." As Han Jin spoke, he winked at the people around him. Some of them had already gone to chase after the scattered groups. At this moment there was still the sound of several helicopter propellers approaching, but this time not only the enemy's planes, but also 11 bases planes were controlling above, so the enemy couldn't find an accurate position to throw explosives for the time being. The area behind Feng Ling was already on fire. In this kind of jungle, any fire was very dangerous. Her chest hurt so much that she felt as if her whole body would split open at any time. However, when Kay and the others were about to help her out nervously, she said in a low voice, "I won't go back to 11 base. Just send me to the hospital." Although her voice was low and soft, almost everyone around her could hear her. Kay immediately looked at her in disbelief. "Feng Ling, do you know that Boss Li has been looking for you for 2 years? In the past 2 years, Boss has been trying to find a way to get you back. 11 base can't live without you." What Grandfather Li did was not reasonable at all. Boss is the person in charge of the base. As long as Boss says you can return to the sniper team, you will still be a member of our 11 base. Shouldn't you go back now? Feng Ling didn't have much emotion. When she was supported by Kay to walk out, she swallowed the blood in her mouth and struggled to support her energy at this moment, but she still said with difficulty in a low voice, "I won't go back." As soon as she said this, Li Nanheng had stopped walking forward and turned back to look at her. At this moment, Feng Ling also raised her head and looked in his direction, only to see his pale face and calm eyes. Feng Ling, Han Jin and Xiao Su held Li Nanheng's hand and kept paying attention to the wound on his back. They frowned and said, "It's not easy for Boss to find you. There was a misunderstanding at that time. At that time we already knew your gender but we didn't expose you. Most people in 11 base still accept you. Don't feel ashamed or hurt because of what those bastards of Team 3 said. We can all understand you. Now that you are injured, let's go back together." "I'll say it again." Feng Ling listened to their words, looked straight into Li Nanheng's eyes and said word by word clearly, "I, Feng Ling, swore 2 years ago that in this life, I will never step into 11 base as a trainee of 11 base. Even if I die here, I will not go back." "Feng Ling, I know you are unhappy but now is not the time to make trouble." "Don't make trouble?" Kay whispered beside her. Feng Ling's eyes were indifferent. "I'm not making trouble. Let me go. I'll go by myself." "Are you kidding me? How can you walk like this?" Kay said as he looked at the blood on her mouth. "You vomited blood. Who do you think you are? If you can walk out of the jungle like this, I can call you grandma." Feng Ling's pale face was expressionless, and she tried to stand upright when she was supported by Kay. She didn't have any intention to rely on anyone in 11 base. Deep in her bones, there was already some kind of hatred and shadow of 11 base that was influenced by obsession. Xiao Su held Li Nanheng's arm and felt that Boss Li's body temperature was decreasing bit by bit. Boss was seriously injured but obviously, what hurt him more was Feng Ling who seemed to have abandoned him. Facing the person he hadn't seen for 2 years, Xiao Su looked at Feng Ling and said, "Feng Ling, we know you have hatred in your heart, but your hatred is also because you once loved him. Just like your hatred for 11 base, that is because you once loved that place deeply. Just like your hatred for Boss Li, it is also because you once loved." "I've never loved." Feng Ling frowned. Li Nanheng's eyes, which were almost unable to focus because of his serious injury, suddenly focused because of her words, and his dark and deep eyes looked straight at her. Xiao Su was speechless because of Feng Ling's decisive words. Looking at this girl who was driven out of the base but now was obviously more ruthless than all of them, he found that even though he knew she was ruthless, he couldn't find a word to blame her. Yes. Anyone who saw her lying on the ground outside the Hall of 11 base and being humiliated, slandered, and driven out of the base by several elders could understand her feelings. If it were anyone else, they would not be willing to step into that place again. You've never loved, have you? At this time, Li Nanheng's low, hoarse voice sounded. Even though it was weak because of excessive blood loss, it was still particularly clear and cold in the quiet jungle. Feng Ling didn't look at him but looked away. I want to chat with more like-minded people about young Master Mo. Have you kissed enough? Talk about life, and find a confidant. Please remember the domain name of this book. For mobile version website, M. Chapter 1054. Seeing that she was unwilling to look at him, Li Nanheng slowly narrowed his cold eyes. Feng Ling, I have never been as honest to anyone as I am to you in my life. Feng Ling was still supported by Kay and leaned against Kay weakly. She looked at the tree trunk not far away and refused to look at the man. Whether you hate or resent what happened 2 years ago, I can give you a reasonable explanation. Even if you can't understand, at least I won't allow these misunderstandings to happen. I told you again and again that I didn't marry any woman, but you never believed me. Fine, I was too confident at that time. I thought that I could take care of both inside and outside, but I ignored your feelings. So I deserve everything that I'm suffering now. The man's low voice sounded haggard and tired, hoarse and cold. No matter what happened, I have never hidden anything from you. I am calm and fearless. My heart is at least pure and sincere to you, but when you deny everything that happened in the past, you also deny yourself, right? Li Nanheng's voice was so cold that both Han Jin and Xiao Su could feel the coldness in Boss's heart at this moment. In addition, they had been holding him, feeling that his body temperature was decreasing bit by bit. They wanted to say that they couldn't delay any longer, or Boss would lose his life. But now they didn't dare to say a word and could only try their best to support him. Under the gaze of the brothers of 11 base, Feng Ling didn't say anything more but just replied, "There's no need to deny it." Nothing happened. Hearing this, Kay immediately pinched Feng Ling's arm hard, reminding her not to challenge Boss's bottom line. Boss had been looking for her for 2 years and had finally found her after much difficulty. Furthermore, both of them were heavily injured, so why did they have to hurt each other at this time? However, it was clear that Feng Ling's heart had been sealed to the point where nothing could enter. Even the slightest change in her expression was suppressed by calmness after she returned from the dangerous situation. There were some things that she should have thought through 2 years ago. She should have held on to them back then so that she wouldn't have left covered in wounds. Li Nanheng looked at her as if he couldn't see all the members of 11 base around him. He only looked at her face and asked, "Have you ever loved me?" The members of 11 base had heard about the relationship between Feng Ling and Boss Li before, but it had always been a wild rumor and everyone was skeptical. Later, when they learned that Feng Ling was a woman, although they were surprised, at least they didn't have other ideas like those bastards in Team 3. But now that they saw this scene and heard this sentence, all of them held their breaths and didn't dare to make a sound. "No," Feng Ling answered straightforwardly. Li Nanheng immediately sneered. His laughter seemed to come from his chest. The man's pale face seemed warm under the reflection of the flames behind Feng Ling, but upon closer inspection, it was extremely cold. "Never liked it?" he asked again. Feng Ling's hands slowly clenched into fists. "No." Li Nanheng sneered at her. "Ridiculous." Kay felt that his heart was almost frozen by this scene and kept muttering in his heart, "My little princess Feng Ling, don't provoke Boss anymore. Look at Boss, take a look at him." However, Feng Ling obviously couldn't feel Kay's worry. She just leaned against his side weakly and said in a low voice, "My life in Boston is peaceful. The kidnapping you encountered that day was just a coincidence. The source of the matter is not me. I'm not in any other danger. Thank you, Boss Li, for saving me once. But today I also saved you once, so we're even." Li Nanheng just looked at her and didn't speak. Everyone felt that Boss Li should be exhausted. They knew that they should quickly help him back, but now no one dared to move or say a word, especially Han Jin and Xiao Su beside Li Nanheng. Facing Boss Li, who was almost broken into pieces, and Feng Ling, who was as hard as an unbreakable iron stone, They didn't even dare to breathe. Have you ever loved me? Li Nanheng seemed to be unwilling to give up and asked again, but this time his voice was calm and low, which made people's hearts cold. Feng Ling frowned as if impatiently and answered hoarsely, yes. Li Nanheng suddenly sneered, abruptly shook off Han Jin and Xiao Su's hands, staggered and barely stood still. He looked straight at the woman who refused to turn her head to him and asked with gritted teeth, let me ask you again, have you ever loved me? At this time Feng Ling finally turned her eyes and met his gaze. Instead of analyzing the emotions in his eyes, she replied coldly, yes, Li Nanheng. It's just a relationship that has no result and doesn't need a result. I'm still young and ignorant, but I've never loved you. I've never loved you. Li Nanheng froze there, looked at her, and was silent for 5 seconds. Feng Ling also looked straight at him, her eyes full of firmness, indifference, and relief, as if she could finally say goodbye to her poor self 2 years ago. Just when Han Jin and Xiao Su couldn't stand it anymore, feeling that Boss Li had never been so frustrated in their lives, they rushed forward to support him, but the man in front of them ignored their outstretched hands, waved them away expressionlessly, and suddenly walked straight toward Feng Ling. It was only a distance of 5 or 6 steps, but every time the man took a step forward, his face became paler and bloodless. Feng Ling didn't know what he was doing and just watched him approach. Kay didn't know what to do now. He was about to speak, but Feng Ling, who was being supported by him, was suddenly grabbed by the man approaching him. She was also seriously injured and couldn't support her body at all, so she stumbled into Li Nanheng's arms. Feng Ling thought he was crazy. When she was about to ask him if he was crazy, the man suddenly clasped her chin, bent down, and kissed her hard. Her eyes widened in an instant. She wanted to push him away, but she didn't have the strength to raise her hands. Her entire body was imprisoned in the man's embrace. He hugged her waist and back, kissing her fiercely as if he wanted to strangle her alive. She only felt that there was a certain taste of blood in both of their mouths. When the taste of blood mixed together, she felt pain all over her body. It was so painful that even her lips and tongue were bitten and sucked by the man cruelly and fiercely, but she didn't feel it. Her entire body was a little stiff, and she wanted to struggle but couldn't. She was kissed crazily in front of everyone. I want to chat with more like-minded people about young Master Mo. Have you kissed enough? Talk about life, and find a confidant. Please remember the domain name of this book. For mobile version website, M. Chapter 1055. Everyone was shocked, but no one dared to stop them. What a joke. This was the first time Boss had kissed a girl in public. Most importantly, the one being kissed was Feng Ling. Even if the two of them were covered in blood and looked battered and exhausted, the visual stimulation was still exhilarating. Yes, that's how it should be. If you love someone, then so be it. What's there to hate? If you don't want to admit your love, then just give it a kiss. Why are you talking so much nonsense? Of course, Feng Ling couldn't hear the cheers in the hearts of this group of people. She just frowned and wanted to push the man in front of her away, but Li Nanheng seemed to use all his strength to hold her, and the force on his lips was so fierce that she couldn't resist it. Her body was already unable to hold on, and now she was seeing stars. She wanted to push him away, but she was still powerless and could only lean against his arms to support herself. She didn't know what was wrong with this man, but he kissed her fiercely. Just as she was about to suffocate, he suddenly let go of her and said hoarsely in a voice that only she could hear, "Remember what you said today." Feng Ling's eyes were a bit stiff. She looked at the man in front of her, but before she could see the emotions in his eyes, she suddenly felt a weight in front of her. The man suddenly pressed his whole body against her. She immediately realized that Li Nanheng finally couldn't hold on anymore. Kay quickly held her from behind. Han Jin and Xiao Su also rushed forward to support Li Nanheng, who had fainted in front of Feng Ling. Boss Li. Boss. Feng Ling, however, was supported by Kay and stood motionless. She looked stiffly at the pale-faced Li Nanheng, who was being helped up by them. Looking at his closed eyes, she felt as if there were countless knives grinding hard in her heart, causing her pain. Seeing the old and new wounds on Li Nanheng's back, Xiao Su suddenly looked at Feng Ling with red eyes, stared at her pale face and said word by word, "Kay, send Miss Feng to the hospital." Kay immediately frowned. "Aren't we going back to the base? Take her to the hospital." Han Jin also said, but he didn't look at Feng Ling again. Instead, he quickly called someone over to send Li Nanheng out. He had lost too much blood. If he stayed here any longer, even his iron body couldn't bear it. Kay didn't speak anymore. Feng Ling stood there. She didn't know if the fire behind her had already begun to burn, but it was so painful that even her whole body felt as though it had been burned. Kay sent her to the hospital as Feng Ling wished. Although he was injured by the explosion, fortunately, there were no external burns. The pain in his internal organs was also due to the huge shock he received at that time. He needed a long time to recuperate. Because there were no external or internal injuries, there were no blood clots, and he could not undergo any surgery. Therefore, Feng Ling only stayed in the hospital for 2 days. After being forced to stay there for observation for 2 days, she went home. But the community where she lived, because of what happened at that time, had been cordoned off by the police. Because the police had to investigate the scene, no one was allowed to enter. So she simply went to live in the martial arts club. There were several temporary rest rooms and dormitories prepared for coaches. Although it was only a very simple half-person bed and a small room of only 6 or 7 square meters, it was enough for her to live in. She didn't lack anything. After sending Feng Ling to the hospital, Kay was originally guarding her, but then he was called away for some reason. Feng Ling didn't tell anyone. When she came back, it was a weekend night. There was no one in the martial arts club. She opened the door, found a restroom, and lay down without even turning on the light. Her whole body was still in great pain and she was completely exhausted. In the past 2 days in the hospital, she hardly slept much. Even if she fell asleep, she had been having messy nightmares, and her mental state was in a state of tension that she couldn't understand. When it was almost dawn, she finally fell asleep. Vaguely, she seemed to hear something outside, the conversation between the head coach and the boss, and the voices of other familiar people working here. The door of her room was closed and no one knew she was here. She closed her eyes to sleep and didn't intend to get up. In the afternoon, Feng Ling got up from the bed with some difficulty. The pain all over her body hadn't disappeared. She sat in the room for a while and then took a look at the time. Today was Monday and she still had 2 classes to attend in the afternoon. Although her current condition might not be suitable for class, she was already here. Even if she only used the verbal method to attend class and did not do much, it would still be the same. Anyway, they were all students for a long time and she did not need to teach them everything. Thinking of this, Feng Ling got up and went out. When she stood up, she was still a little shaky, but fortunately she could still stand. When she walked out of the restroom, the head coach happened to come here to get something. Suddenly seeing Feng Ling coming out of the door, he looked at her in surprise. "When did you come here? You've been missing for the past 2 days. I couldn't find you on the phone. I heard that something happened to your place. The boss and I were about to go to the police station to report it. Why are you?" "It's okay. Sorry to make you worry. I slept here last night." Feng Ling explained and walked out. The head coach looked at her pale and haggard face and turned to ask her a few more questions. Feng Ling didn't answer but went straight to the classroom. In the afternoon, during the class, Feng Ling sat in the front seat and watched them have class. Qin Beiqing was in this class and Qin Beiqing had been paying attention to her. He felt that she didn't look good. She seemed to have lost a lot of weight in just 2 or 3 days. She didn't look right. Originally, he planned to ask her what happened after class, but when the class was only halfway through, a group of people in black uniforms broke in and broke the peace in the martial arts club. Feng Ling was asked to leave. All the people in the martial arts club looked at those people in black uniforms, standing in 2 rows from the door to the inside. Looking at their majestic appearance, they couldn't guess what had happened. Feng Ling was called out. She walked out and saw that these people were wearing the uniforms of 11 base. She stood inside and looked at the door without saying anything. Then a man in the same black uniform came in, but his armband and chest tag were more than others, so it could be seen that he was not a simple person. It was Han Jin. Feng Ling looked at him. Han Jin came in expressionlessly and walked up to Feng Ling. "Miss Feng, come with us." Feng Ling was stunned. Feng Ling raised her eyes. "I've already said what I should say. Where do you want me to go?" Han Jin's tone was indifferent. "Boss hasn't woken up yet. You have to go with us. When he wakes up safely, I will let you go immediately. I want to chat with more like-minded people about Young Master Mo. Have you kissed enough? Talk about life, and find a confidant. Please remember the domain name of this book. For mobile version website, M. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.